Chapter 1 of The Bright Messenger by Algernon Blackwood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark Douglas Nelson. The Bright Messenger. Chapter 1. Edward Fillory, so far as may be possible to a man of normal passions and emotions, took a detached view of life and human nature. At the age of 38, he still remained a spectator, a searching, critical, analytical, yet chiefly perhaps a sympathetic spectator, before the great performance whose stage is the planet and whose performers and auditorium are humanity. Knowing himself outcast, an unwelcome deadhead at the play, he had yet felt no bitterness against the parents whose fierce, illicit passion had deprived him of an honorable seat. The first shock of resentment over, he had faced the situation with a tolerance which showed an unusual charity, an exceptional understanding in one so young. He was 20 when he learned the truth about himself, and it was his wondering analysis as to why two loving humans could be so careless of their offspring's welfare, when the rest of nature took such pains in the matter, that first betrayed perhaps his natural aptitude. He had the innate gift of seeing things as they were, undisturbed by personal emotion, while yet asking himself with scientific accuracy why and how they came to be so. These were invaluable qualities in the line of knowledge and research he chose for himself as psychologist and doctor. The terms are somewhat loose. His longing was to probe the motives of conduct in the first place, and in the second to correct the results of wrong conduct by removing faulty motives. Psychiatrist and healer, therefore, were his more accurate titles. Psychiatrist and healer, in due course, he became. His father, an engineer of ability and enterprise, prospecting in the remoter parts of the Caucasus for copper, and making a comfortable fortune in so doing, was carried off his feet suddenly by the beauty of a Caucasian peasant girl, daughter of a shepherd in these lonely and majestic mountains, whose intolerable grandeur may well intoxicate a man to madness. A dangerous and disgraceful episode it seems to have been between John Fillory, hitherto of steady moral fibre, and this strange, lovely pagan girl, whose savage father hunted the pair of them high and low for weeks before they finally eluded him in the azalea valleys beyond Artvine. Great passion, possibly great love, born of this enchanted land whose peaks touch heaven, while their lower turfy slopes are carpeted with lilies, azaleas, rhododendrons, contributed to the birth of Edward, who first saw the light in a secret chamber of a dirty Tiflis house above the Kora torrent. That same night, when the sun dipped beneath the Black Sea waters 200 miles to the westward, his mother had looked for the last time upon her northern lover and her wild Caucasian mountains. Edward, however, persisted, visible emblem of a few weeks' primal passion in a primal land. Intense desire, born in this remote wilderness of amazing loveliness, lent him perhaps a strain of illicit, almost unearthly yearning, a secret nostalgia for some lost veil of beauty that held fiercer sunshine, mightier winds, and fairer flowers than those he knew in this world. At the age of 4, he was brought to England. His Russian memories faded, though not the birthright of his primitive blood. Settling in London, his father increased his fortune as consulting engineer, but did not marry. To the short, vehement episode he had given of his very best, he remained true to his gorgeous memory and his sin. The cream of his life, its essence and its perfume, had been spent in those wild, wind-swept azalea valleys beyond Artvine. The azalea honey was in his blood, the scent of the lilies in his brain. He still heard the Kora and Ryan foaming down towards ancient Colchis. Edward embodied for him the spirit of these sweet, passionate memories. He loved the boy, he cherished and he spoilt him. but Edward had stuff in him that rendered spoiling harmless. A vigorous, independent youngster, he showed firmness and character as a lad. To the delight of his father, he knew his own mind early, reading and studying on his own account, possessed at the same time by a vehement love of nature and outdoor life that was far more than the average English boy's inclination to open air and sport. There lay some primal quality in his blood that was of ancient origin and leaned towards wildness. There seemed almost at the same time a faunish strain that turned away from life. As a tiny little fellow, he had that strange touch of creative imagination other children have also known, an invisible playmate. It had no name, as it apparently had no sex. The boy's father could trace it directly to no fairy tale read or heard. Its origin in the child's mind remained a mystery. Yet its characteristics were unusual, even for such fanciful imaginings. Too full-fledged to have been created gradually by the boy's loneliness, it seemed half goblin and half nature spirit. It replaced, at any rate, the little brothers and sisters who were not there, and the father, led by his conscience possibly to divine or half-divine its origin, met the pretense with sympathetic encouragement. It came usually with the wind, moreover, and went with the wind, and wind accordingly excited the child. "Listen, father," he would exclaim when no air was moving anywhere and the day was still as death. Then, plop, so there you are, as though it had dropped through empty space and landed at his feet. "It came from a tremendous height," the child explained. "The wind's up there, you see, today." Which struck the parent's mind as odd, because it proved later true. An upper wind, far in the higher strata of air, came down an hour or so afterwards and blew into a storm. Fire and flowers, too, were connected with this invisible playmate. "He'll make it burn, father," the child said convincingly when the chimney smoked and the coals refused to catch, and then became very busy with his friend in the grate and about the hearth, just as though he helped and superintended what was being invisibly accomplished. "It's burning better, anyhow," agreed the father, astonished in spite of himself, as the coals began to glow and spurt their gassy flames. "Well done. I am very much obliged to you and your little friend." "But it's the only thing he can do. He likes it. It's his work, really, don't you see? Keeping up the heat and things."
"Oh, it's his natural job, is it? I see, yes. But my thanks to him all the same."
"Thank you very much," said grave Edward, aged 5, addressing his tiny friend among the fire-irons. "I'm much obliged to you." Edward was a bit older when the flower incident took place, with the geranium that no amount of care and coaxing seemed able to keep alive. It had been dying slowly for some days, when Edward announced that he saw its inside flitting about the plant, but unable to get back into it. "It's got out, you see, and can't get back into its body again, so it's dying."
"Well, what in the world are we to do about it?" asked his father.
"I'll ask," was the solemn reply. "Now I know," he cried, delighted, after asking his question of the empty air and listening for the answer. "Of course, now I see. Look, father, there it is, its spirit." He stood beside the flower and pointed to the earth in the pot.
"Dear me, yes. Where do you see it? I don't see it quite."
"He says I can pick it up and put it back, and then the flower will live." The child put out a hand as though picking up something that moved quickly about the stem.
"What's it look like?" asked his father quickly.
"Oh, sort of triangles and things with lines and corners," was the reply, making a gesture as though he caught it and popped it back into the red drooping blossoms. "There you are. Now you're alive again. Thank you very much, please." This last remark to the invisible playmate who was superintending.
"A sort of geometrical figure, was it?"
inquired the father next day, when, to his surprise, he found the geranium blooming in full health and beauty once again. "That's what you saw, eh?" "It was its spirit, and it was shiny red, like fire," the child replied. "It's heat. Without these things, there'd be no flowers at all." "Who makes everything grow?" he asked suddenly, a moment later. "You mean, what makes them grow?" "Who?" he repeated with emphasis. "Who builds the bodies up and looks after them?" "Ah, the structure, you mean, the form." Edward nodded. His father had the feeling he was not being asked for information, but was being cross-examined. A faint pressure, as of uneasiness, touched him. "They develop automatically. That means naturally, under the laws of nature," he replied. "And the laws? Who keeps them working properly?" The father, with a mental gulp, replied that God did. "A beetle's body, for instance, or a daisy's, or an elephant's?" persisted the child, undeceived by the theological evasion. "Or mine? Or a mountain's?" John Fillory racked his brain for an answer, while Edward continued his list to include sea anemones, frost patterns, fire, wind, moon, sun, and stars. All these forms to him were bodies, apparently. "I know!" he exclaimed suddenly with intense conviction, clapping his hands together and standing on his toes. "Do you indeed? Then you know more than the rest of us." "They do, of course," came the positive announcement. "The other kind. It's their work. Yours, for instance." He turned to his playmate, but so naturally and convincingly that a chill ran down his father's spine as he watched. "Is fire, isn't it? You showed me once. And water stops you, but wind helps you." And he continued long after his father had left the room. With advancing years, however, Edward either forgot his playmate or kept its activities to himself. He no longer referred to it, at any rate. His energies demanded a bigger field. He roamed the fields and woods, climbed the hills, stayed out all night to see the sunrise, made fires even when fires were not exactly needed, and hunted with red Indians and with what he called windy fire people everywhere. He was never in the house. He ran wild. Great open spaces, trees and flowers were what he liked. The sea, on the other hand, alarmed him. Only wind and fire comforted him and made him happy and full of life. He was a playmate of wind and fire. Water, in large quantities at any rate, was inimical. With concealed approval, masking a deep love fulfilled yet incomplete, his father watched the growth of this fiercer strain that mere covert shooting could not satisfy, nor ordinary sporting holidays appease. "England's too small for you, Edward, isn't it?" he asked once tentatively, when the boy was about 15. "The English people, you mean, father?" "You find them dull, don't you? And the island a bit cramped, eh?" Edward waited without replying. He did not quite understand what his indulgent father intended, or was leading up to. "You'd like to travel and see things and people for yourself, I mean." He watched the boy without, as he thought the latter noticing. The answer pleased but puzzled him. "We're all much the same, aren't we?" said Edward. "Well, with differences, yes we are. But still, it's only the same over and over again, isn't it?" Then, while his father was thinking of this reply, and of what he should say to it, the boy asked suddenly, with arresting intensity, "Are we the only people? The only sort of beings, I mean? Just men and women like us all over the world? No others of any sort? Bigger, for instance, or more wild and wonderful?" Then he added, a thrust of strange yearning in his face and eyes, "More beautiful?" He almost whispered the last words. His father winced. He divined the origin of that strange inquiry. Upon those immense and lonely mountains, distant in space and time for him, Imagination, rich and pagan, ran, he well knew, to vast and mighty beings, superior to human, benignant and maleficent, akin to the stimulating and exhilarating conception of the gods, and certainly non-human.
"Nothing, Edward, that we know of. Why should there be?"
"Oh, I don't know, Dad. I just wondered, sometimes. But, as you say, we've not a scrap of evidence, of course."
"Not a scrap," agreed his father. "Poetic legends ain't evidence."
The mind ruled the heart in Edward. He had his father's brains, at any rate, and all his powers and longings focused in a single line that indicated plainly what his career should be. The public schools could help him little. He went to Edinburgh to study medicine. He passed eventually with all possible honors, and the day he brought home the news, his father, dying, told him the secret of his illegitimate birth. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Bright Messenger by Algernon Blackwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Bright Messenger, Chapter 2. The subsequent 20 years or so may be summarized. Alone in the world, of a loving, passionate nature, he deliberately set all thought of marriage on one side as an impossibility, and directed his entire energy into the acquirement of knowledge, reading, studying, experimenting far outside the circle of the ordinary medical man. The attitude of detachment he had adopted became a habit. He believed it was now his nature. The more he learned of human frailty and human faculties, the greater became the charity he felt towards his fellow kind. In his own being, it seemed, lay something big, sweet, simple, a generosity that longed to share with others, a tolerance more ready to acquit than to condemn, above all, a great gift of understanding sympathy that, doubtless, was the explanation of his singular insight. Rarely he found it in him to blame. Forgiveness, based upon the increasing extent of his experience, seemed his natural view of human mistakes and human infirmities. His one desire, his one hope, was to serve the race. Yet he himself remained aloof. He watched the play, but took no part in it. This forgiveness, too, began at home. His grievance had not soured or dejected him, his father's error presenting itself as a problem to be pondered over rather than a sin to blame. Some day, he promised himself, he would go and see with his own eyes the Caucasian tribe whence his blood was partially derived, whence his un-English yearnings for a wilder scale of personal freedom amid an unstained, majestic nature were first stolen. The inherited picture of a Caucasian veil of loveliness and liberty lay, indeed, very deep in his nature, emerging always like a symbol when he was profoundly moved. At any crisis in his life, it rose beckoning, seductive, haunting beyond words. Curious, ill-defined emotions with it that drove him towards another standard, another state, to something, at any rate, he could neither name nor visualize, yet that seemed to dwarf the only life he knew. About it was a touch of strange, unearthly radiance that dimmed existence as he knew it. The shine went out of it. There was involved in this symbolic valley something wholly new both in color, sound, and outline, yet that remained obstinately outside definition. First, however, he must work, develop himself, and broaden, deepen, extend in every possible way the knowledge of his kind that seemed his only love. He began in a very practical way, setting up his plate in a mean quarter of the great metropolis, healing, helping, learning with his heart as well as with his brain, observing life at closest quarters from its beginning to its close, his sympathies becoming enriched the more he saw, and his mind groping its way towards clearer insight the more he read, thought, studied. His wealth made him independent. His tastes were simple, his wants few. He observed the great play from the pit and gallery, from the wings, from behind the scenes as well. Moving then into the stalls, into a wealthier neighborhood, that is, he repeated the experience among another class, finding, however, little difference except in the greater artificiality of his types, the larger proportion of mental and nervous ailments, of hysteria, delusion, imaginary troubles, and the like. The infirmities due to idleness, inflamed vanity, and luxury offered a new field, though to him a less attractive one. The farther from simplicity, from the raw facts of living, the more complicated, yet the more trivial, the resulting disabilities. These, however, were quite as real as those, and harder indeed to cure. Idle imagination, fostered by opportunity and means, yet forced by conventionality to wear infinite disguises, brought a strange, if far from a noble, crop of disorders into his ken. Yet he accepted them for serious treatment, whatever his private opinion may have been, while his patience, tact, and sympathy, backed by his insight and great knowledge, brought him quick success. He was soon in a fair way to become a fashionable doctor. But the field he found was restricted somewhat. His quest was knowledge, not fame or money. He chose his cases where he could, though actually refusing nothing. He specialized more and more with afflictions of a mental kind. He was immensely successful in restoring proportion out of disorder. He revealed people to themselves. He taught them to recover lost hope and confidence. He used little medicine, but stimulated the will towards a revival of fading vitality. Autosuggestion, rather than suggestion or hypnotism, was his method. He healed. He began to be talked about. Then suddenly his house was sold, his plate was taken down, he vanished. Human beings object to sudden changes whose secret they have not been told and cannot easily guess. His abrupt disappearance caused talk and rumors, led, of course, by those chiefly disappointed women who had most reason to be grateful for past services. But if the words charlatan and quack were whispered, he did not hear them. He had taken the post of assistant in a lunatic asylum in a northern town, because the work promised him increase of knowledge and experience in his own particular field. The talk he left behind him mattered as little as the small pay attached to the humble duties he had accepted. London forgot him, but he did not forget what London had taught him. A new field opened, and in less than 2 years opportunity, combined with his undoubted qualifications, saw him head of an establishment where he could observe at first hand the facts and phenomena that interested him most. Humane treatment, backed by profound insight into the derangements of the poor human creatures under his charge, brought the place into a fame it had never known before. He spent 5 years there in profound study and experiment. He achieved new results and published them. His experimental psychology caused a sensation. His name was known. He was an authority. At this time he was well past 30, a tall, dark, distinguished-looking man, of appearance grave and even somber. Imposing, too, with his quiet, piercing eyes, but somber only until the smile lit up his somewhat rugged face. It was a face that nobody could lie to, but to that smile the suffering heart might tell its inmost secrets with confidence, hope, trust, and without reserve. There followed several years abroad, in Paris, Rome, St. Petersburg, Moscow. Vienna and Zurich he also visited to test there certain lines of research and to meet personally their originators. This period was partly a holiday, partly an opportunity to know at first hand the leaders in mental therapeutics, psychology, and the rest, and also that he might find time to digest and arrange his own accumulation of knowledge with a view, later, to undertaking the life work to which his previous experience was but preliminary. Fame had come to him unsought. His published works alone ensured his going down to posterity as a careful but daring and original judge of the human species and its possibilities. It was the supernormal rather than the merely abnormal powers that attracted him. In the subconscious, as equally in the superconscious, his deep experience taught him, lay amazing powers of both moral and physical healing, powers as yet but little understood, powers as limitless as they seemed incredible, as mysterious in their operation as they were simple in their accessibility. And autosuggestion was the means of using them. The great men whom he visited welcomed him with open arms, added to his data, widened yet further his mental outlook. Sought by high and low in many countries and in strangest cases, his experience grew and multiplied. His assortment of unusual knowledge was far-reaching, till he stood finally in wonder and amazement before the human being and its unrealized powers, and his optimism concerning the future progress of the race became more justified with every added fact. Yet perhaps his greatest achievement was the study of himself. It was probably to this deep, intimate, and honest research into his own being that his success in helping others was primarily due. For in himself, though mastered and coordinated by his steady will, rendered harmless by his saving sense of humor, and, as he believed, by the absence of any harbored grievance against others, in his very own being lay all those potential elements of disorder, those loose, unraveled threads of alien impulse and suppressed desire which can make for dangerous disintegration, and thus produce the disturbing results classed generally under alienation and neurosis. The incongruous elements in him were the gift of nature. Know thyself was the saving attitude he brought to that gift, redeeming it. This phrase, borrowed, he remembered with a smile, for the portal of the ancient mysteries, remained his watchword. He was able to thank the fierce illicit love that furnished his body and his mental makeup for a richer field of first-hand study than years of practice among others could have supplied. He belonged by temperament to the unstable, but he was aware of it. He realized the two beings in him, the reasoning, scientific man and the speculative dreamer, visionary, poet. The latter wondered, dreamed among a totally different set of values, far below and out of sight. The deeper portion of himself was forever beating up for recognition, clamoring to be used, yet with a strange shyness that reminded him of a loving woman who cannot be certain her passion is returned. It hinted, threatened, wept, and even sulked. It rose like a flame, bringing its own light and wind, blessed his whole being with some divine assurance. And then, because not instantly accepted, it retired, leaving him empty, his mind colored with unearthly yearnings, with poignant regrets, yet perfumed as though the fairness of spring herself had lit upon his heart and kissed it into blossom on her passage north. It presented its amazing pictures and withdrew. Elusive, as the half-memory of some radiant dream whose wonder and sweetness had been intense to the point of almost pain, it hovered, floating just out of reach. It lay waiting for that sincere belief which would convince that its passion was returned. And a fleeting picture of a wild Caucasian valley, steeped in sunshine and flowers, was always the first sign of its awakening. Though not afraid of reason, it seemed somehow independent of the latter's processes. It was his reason, however, he well knew, that dimmed the light in its grand, terrible eyes, causing it to withdraw the instant he began to question. Precise, formal thinking shut the engines off and damped the furnaces. His love, his passion, nonetheless, were there, hiding with belief, until some bright messenger, bringing glad tidings, should reveal the method of harmonious union between reason and vision, between man's trivial normal faculties and his astounding supernormal possibilities. This element of feeling in our outlook on nature is a satisfaction in itself, but our plea for allowing it to operate in our interpretation of nature is that we get closer to some things through feeling than we do through science. The tendency of feeling is always to see things whole. We cannot, for our life's sake, and for the sake of our philosophical reconstruction, afford to lose in scientific analysis what the poets and artists and the lovers of nature all see. It is intuitively felt, rather than intellectually perceived, the vision of things as totalities, root and all in all, neither fancifully nor mystically, but sympathetically in their wholeness. To these words of Professor T. Arthur Thomson's he heartily subscribed, applying their principle to his own particular field. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The Bright Messenger by Algernon Blackwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Bright Messenger, Chapter 3. The net result of his inquiries and research, when, at the age of nearly 40, he established his own private home for unusual, so-called hopeless cases in northwest London — it was free to all, and as spiritual clinique he thought of it sometimes with a smile — may be summed up in the single sentence that man is greater than he knows, and that completer realization of his full possibilities lies accessible to his subconscious and superconscious powers. Herein he saw, indeed, the chief hope of progress for humanity. And it was to the failures, the diseased, the evil, and the broken that he owed chiefly his inspiring optimism, since it was largely in collapse that occurred the sporadic upheaval of those supernormal forces which, controlled, coordinated, led, must eventually bring about the realization he foresaw. The purpose, however, of these notes is not to furnish a sensational story of various patients whom he studied, healed, or failed to heal. Its object is to give some details of one case in particular, whose outstanding peculiarities affected his theories and convictions, leaving him open-minded still, but with a breath of awe in his heart perhaps, before a possibility his previous knowledge had ruled entirely out of court, even if, which is doubtful, he had ever considered it as a possibility at all. He had realized early that the individual manifests but an insignificant portion of his being in his ordinary existence, the normal self being the tip of his consciousness only, yet whose fuller expression rises readily to adequate evocation. And it was the study of genius, of prodigy so-called, and of certain faculties shown sometimes in hysteria, that led him to believe these were small jets from a sea of power that might, indeed ought, to be realizable at will. The phenomena all pointed, he believed, to powers that seemed as superior to cerebral functions as they were independent of these. Man's possible field of being, in other words, seemed capable of indefinite extension. His heart glowed within him as he established, step by step, these greater powers. He dared to foresee a time when the limitations of separate personality would have been destroyed, and the vast brotherhood of the race become literally realized, its practical unity accomplished. The difficulties were endless and discouraging. The inventive powers of the bigger self, its astonishing faculty for dramatizing its content in every conceivable form, blocked everywhere the search for truth. It could, he found, also detach a portion of its content into a series of separate personalities, each with its individual morals, talents, tendencies, each with its distinct and separate memory. These fragments it could project, so to speak, masquerading convincingly as separate entities, using strange languages, offering detailed knowledge of other conditions, distant in time and space, suggesting indeed to the unwary that they were due to obsessing spirits, and leaving the observer in wonder before the potential capacity of the central self disgorging them. The human depths included, beyond mere telepathy and extended telepathy, an expansion of consciousness so vast as to be apparently limitless. The past, on rare occasions even the future, lay open. The entire planetary memory, stored with rich and pregnant accumulated experience, was accessible and shareable. New aspects of space and time were equally involved. A vision of incredible grandeur opened gradually before his eyes. The surface consciousness of today was really rather a trumpery affair. The gross lethargy of the vast majority, vis-à-vis the greater possibilities, afflicted him. To this surface consciousness alone was so-called evil possible as ignorance. As ugly is only halfway to a thing, so evil is halfway to good. With the greater powers must come greater knowledge, shared as by instantaneous wireless over the entire planet. And misunderstanding, chief obstacle to progress always, would be impossible. A huge unity, sense of oneness, must follow. Moral growth would accompany the increase of faculty. And here and there, it seemed to him, the surface ice had thawed already a little. The pressure of the great deeps below caused cracks and fissures. Autosuggestion, prototype of all suggestion, offered mysterious hints of the way to reach the stupendous underworld, as the Christian scientists, the miraculous healers, the New Thought movement, saints, prophets, poets, artists were finding out. The subliminal, to state it shortly, might be the divine. This was the hope, though not yet the actual belief, that haunted and inspired him. Behind his personality lurked this strange, gigantic dream, ever beating to get through. In his private home, helping, healing, using his great gifts of sympathy and insight, he at the same time found the material for intimate study and legitimate experiment he sought. The building had been altered to suit his exact requirements. There were private suites, each with its door and staircase to the street. One part of it provided his own living quarters, shut off entirely from the patient side. In another, equally cut off and self-contained, yet within easy communication of his own rooms, lived Paul Debenham, his valued young assistant. There was a third private suite as well. The entire expenses he defrayed himself. Here, then, for a year or two, he worked indefatigably, with the measure of success and failure he anticipated. Here he dreamed his great dream of the future of the race, in whose progress and infinite capacities he hopefully believed. Work was his love, the advancement of humanity his God. The war availed itself of his great powers, as also of his ready-made establishment, both of which he gave without a thought of self. New material came as well from the battlefields into his ken. The effect of the terrible 5 years upon him was in direct proportion to his sincerity. His mind was not the type that shirks conclusions, nor fears to look facts in the face. For really new knowledge, he was ever ready to yield all previous theories, to scrap all he had held hitherto for probable. His mind was open, he sought only truth. The war, above all the peace, shook his optimism. If it did not wholly shatter his belief in human progress, it proved such progress to be so slow that his utopia faded into remotest distance, and his dream of perfectibility became the faintest possible star in his hitherto bright sky of hope. He felt shocked and stupefied. The reaction was greater than at first he realized. He had often pitied the mind that, aware only of its surface consciousness, uninformed by thrill or shift of the greater powers below and above, lived unwarned of its own immenser possibilities. To such, the evidence for extended human faculties must seem explicable by fraud, illusion, derangement, to be classed as abnormal rubbish worthy only of the alienist's attention as diseases. To him such minds, though able, with big intellects among them, had ever seemed a prejudiced, fossilized, prehistoric type. Restricted by their very nature, violently resisting new ideas, they might be intense within their actual scope, but with vision denied them, they never could be really great. One effect of the shock he had undergone will be evident by merely stating that he now understood this type of mind a good deal better than before. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of The Bright Messenger by Algernon Blackwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Bright Messenger, Chapter 4. The war was over, though the benefits of the long-anticipated peace still kept provocatively, exasperatingly out of reach, when about the middle of September Dr. Fillory received a letter that interested him deeply. The shattered world was still distraught, uneasy. Nervously eager to resume its former activities, it was yet waiting for the word that should give it the necessary confidence to begin. Doubt, insecurity, uncertainty everywhere dominated human minds. Those who hoped for a renewal of the easy, careless mood of pre-war days were dismayed to find this was impossible. Others, who had allowed an optimistic idealism to prophesy a new age, looked about them bewilderingly and in vain for signs of its fair birth. The latter, to whom perhaps Dr. Fillory belonged, were more bitterly disappointed, more cruelly shocked than the former. The race, it seemed to many unshirking eyes, had leapt back centuries at a single spring. The gulf of primal savagery which had gaped wide open for 5 years, proving the Stone Age close beneath the surface of so-called civilization, had not yet fully closed. Its jaws still dripped blood, hatred, selfishness. The race was still dislocated by the convincing disproof of progress, horrified at the fierce reality which had displaced the twopence-colored dream it had been complacently worshipping hitherto. Men in the mass undoubtedly were savages still. To Dr. Fillory, an honest, though not a necessarily fundamental pessimism, seemed justified. He believed in progress still, but as his habit was, he faced the facts. His attitude lost something of its original enthusiasm. Looking about him, he saw no big, constructive movement. The figure who more than any other was altering the face of the world with his ideas as well as his armies was avowedly destructive only. He found himself a sobered and a saddened man. His private home, having accomplished splendid work, had just discharged its last shell-shocked patient. It was now empty again. The staff, carefully chosen and proved by long service, dismissed on holidays. The building itself renovated and repaired against the arrival later of new patients that were expected. Debenham, his assistant, away for a period of rest in Switzerland, would be back in a week or two, and Dr. Fillory, before resuming his normal work, found himself with little to do but watch the progress of the cleaners, painters, and carpenters at work. Into this brief time of leisure dropped the strange, perplexing letter with an effect distinctly stimulating. It promised an unusual case. A patient, if patient the case referred to could properly be called, a young man who, if you decide after careful reflection to reject, can be looked after only by the state, which means, of course, an asylum for the insane. I know you are no longer head of the establishment in Liverpool, but that you confine yourself to private work along similar lines, though upon a smaller scale, and that you welcome only cases that have been given up as hopeless. I honor your courage and your sympathy. I know your skill. So far as a cure is conceivable, this one is hopeless, certainly, but its unusual, indeed its unique character entitles it, I believe, to be placed among your chosen few. Love, sympathy, patience, combined with the closest observation it urgently demands. And these qualities, associated with unrivaled skill, you must allow me again to think you alone possess among healers and helpers of strange minds. For over 20 years, in the solitudes of these Jura forests and mountains, I have cared for him as best I could, and with a devotion a child of my own might have expected. But now, my end not far away, I cannot leave him behind me, here uncared for. Yet the alternative, the impersonal and formal care of an institute, must break my heart and his. I turn to you. My advanced age and growing infirmities, in these days of unkind travel, prohibit my bringing him over. Can your great heart suggest a means, since I feel sure you will not refuse the care of this strange being whose nature and peculiarities indicate your especial care, and yours alone? Is it too much to wonder if you yourself could come and see him, here in the remote mountain chalet, where I have tended and cared for him ever since his mother died in bearing him over 20 years ago? I have taught him what seemed wise and best. I have guarded and observed him. He knows little or nothing of an outside world of men and women, and is ignorant of life in the ordinary meaning of the word. What precisely he may be, to what stratum of consciousness he belongs, what kind of being he is, I mean— The last 2 lines were then scored through, though left legible. I feel with Arago that he is a rash man who pronounces the word impossible anywhere outside the sphere of pure mathematics. More sentences were here scored through. Dare I say, to you as master, teacher, great open-minded soul, that to human life, as we know it, he does not perhaps belong? In writing, in this letter, I find it impossible to give you full details. I had intended to set them down. My pen refuses. In the plain English at my disposal, well, simply, it is not credible. But I have kept full notes all these years, and the notes belong to you. I enclose an imperfect painting I made of him some 4 years ago. I am no artist. For background you must imagine what lay beyond my little skill, the blazing glory of the immense wood fires that he loves to make upon the open mountainside, usually at dawn after a night of prayer and singing, while waiting for the strange power he derives, as we all do indeed at second or third hand, from the worship of what is to him his mighty father, the life-giving sun. Wind, as the messengers of the sun, he worships too. Both sun and wind, that is, produce an unusual state approaching ecstasy. Counting upon you, I have hypnotized him, suggesting that he forget all the immediate past, in fact to date, and telling him he will like you in place of me, though with him it is an uncertain method. I am now old in years. I have lived and loved, suffered and dreamed like most of us. My hands have been warmed at the fires of life, of which, let me add, I am not ignorant. You have known, I believe, my serious, as also my lighter imaginative books. My occasional correspondence with your colleague, Paul Debenham, has been of help and guidance to me. We are not, therefore, wholly strangers. The 20 years spent in these solitudes among simple peasant folk, with a single object of devotion to fill my days, have been, I would tell you, among the best of my long existence. My renouncement of the world was no renouncement. I am enriched with wonder and experience that amaze me, for the world holds possibilities few have ever dreamed of, and that I myself, filled as I am with the memory of their contemplation, can hardly credit even now. Perhaps, in an earlier stage of evolution, as Delboeuf believes, man was fully aware of all that went on within himself. A region since closed to us, owing to attention being increasingly directed outwards. Into some such region I have had a glimpse, it seems. I feel sometimes there was as much fact as fancy, perhaps, in the wise old Hebrew, who stated poetically, recently too, compared with the stretch of time my science deals with, the sons of God took to themselves daughters of the children of men. The letter here broke off, as though interrupted by something unexpected and unusual. It was signed, indeed, John Mason, but signed in pencil and at the bottom of an unwritten blank sheet. It had not all been written either at one time, or on the same day. There were intervals, evidently, perhaps of hours, perhaps of days, between the paragraphs. Dr. Fillory read, reread, then read again the strange epistle, coming each time to the same conclusion. The writer was dying in the very act of forming the last sentences. Their incoherence, the alteration in the style, were thus explained. He had felt the end of life so close that he had written his signature, probably addressed the envelope as well, knowing the page might never be filled up. It had not been filled up. Something behind the phrases, behind the intensity of the actual words, beyond the queer touches that revealed a mind betrayed by solitude, the hints possibly of a deluded intelligence, there was something that rang true and stimulated him more than ordinarily. The reference to Debenham, too, was definite enough. Dr. Fillory remembered vaguely a correspondence during recent crowded years with a man named Mason, living away in Switzerland somewhere, and that Debenham had asked him questions from time to time about what he called, with his rough-and-ready and half-humorous classification, pagan obsession, worshipper of fire and wind, referring it to the writer of the letters, named John Mason. Non-human delusion, he had also called it sometimes. They had come to refer to it, he remembered, as N.H., in fact. He now looked up those notes, for the mention of the books caused him an uncomfortable feeling of neglected opportunity, and John Mason was an honored name. "You know, I believe, my books," the writer said. Could this be, he asked himself anxiously, John Mason, the eminent geologist? Had Debenham not realized who he was? Must he blame his assistant, whose jealous care and judgment saved him so many foolish, futile, unreal cases, reserving what was significant and important only? The notes established his mistakes and his assistant's, perhaps intentional, ignorance. The writer of this curious letter was, unquestionably, the author of those fairy books for children, old and young, whose daring speculations had suggested that other types and races, ages even before the Neanderthal man, had dwelt side by side with what is known as modern man upon this time-worn planet. Behind the literary form of legend and fairy tale, however, lay a curious conviction. Atlantis was of yesterday compared with earlier civilizations, now extinct by fire and flood and general upheaval, which once may have inhabited the globe. The present evolutionary system, buttressed by Darwin and the rest, was but a little recent insignificant series, trivial both in time and space, when set beside the mightier systems that had come and gone. Their evidence he found not in clumsy fossils and footprints on cooled rocks, but in the minds of those who had followed and eventually survived them, memories of Titan wars and mighty beings, and gods and goddesses of non-human kind, to whose different existence the physical conditions of an overheated planet presented no impossibility. The human species, this trumpery, limited, self-satisfied super-animal man, was not the only type of being. Yet John Mason, in his day, had held the chair at Edinburgh University. His lectures embodied common sense and knowledge, with acutest imaginative insight. His earliest writings were the textbooks of the time. His name, when Edward Fillory was medical student there, still hovered like well-loved incense above the old town towers. The notes now intrigued him. No blame attached to Debenham for having missed the cue. Debenham could not know everything. Geology was not in his line of work and knowledge, and Mason was a common name. Rather, he blamed himself for not having been struck by the oddness of the case. The Mason letters, the pagan obsession, worshipper of wind and fire, the strange N.H. "A competent indexer, at any rate," he said to himself with a smile as he turned up the details easily. These were very scanty. Debenham evidently had deemed the case of questionable value. The letters from Mason, with the answers to them, he could not find. The slight record was headed Mason John, followed by an address: Chez Henri Petival, peasant, Jura Mountains, Vaud, French Switzerland, and details how to reach this apparently remote valley by mule and carriage and footpath. Name of Mason's protégé not given. Sex, male. Age, born 1895. Parentage, couple of mystical temperament, sincere but suffering from marked delusions, believers in magic, various but chiefly concerned with nature and natural forces, once known, forgotten today, of immense potency, accessible to certain practices of logical but undetailed kind, able apparently to intensify human consciousness. Subject of extremely quick intelligence, but betrays ignorance of human conditions. Intelligence superior to human, though sometimes inferior. Long periods of quiescence, followed by immense, almost superhuman activity and energy. Worships fire and air, chiefly the former, calling the sun his father and deity. Abhors confined space. This shown by intense desire for heat, which, together with free space, air, seem conditions of well-being. Fears, as in claustrophobia, both water and solidity, anything massive. Has great physical power, yet indifferent to its use. Women irresistibly attracted to him, but his attitude towards other sex seems one of gentleness and pity. Love means nothing. Has, on the other hand, extraordinarily high ideal of service. Is puzzled by quarrels and differences of personal kind. Half memories of vast system of myriad workers, ruled by this ideal of harmonious service. Faithful, true, honest. Falseness or lies impossible. Lovable, pathetic, helpless type. The notes broke off abruptly. Dr. Fillory, wondering a little that his subordinate's brief but suggestive summary had never been brought to his notice before, turned a moment to glance at the rough watercolor drawing he held in his hand. He looked at it for some moments with absorption. The expression of his face was enigmatical. He was more than surprised that Debenham had not drawn his attention to the case in detail. Placing his hand so as to hide the lower portion of the face, he examined the eyes, then turned the portrait upside down, gazing at the eyes afresh. He seemed lost in thought for a considerable time. A faint flush stole into his cheek, and a careful observer might have noticed an increase of light about the skin. He sighed once or twice, and presently, laying the portrait down again, he turned back to the dossier upon the table in front of him. Very accurate and careful, he said to himself with satisfaction as he noticed the date Debenham had set against the entries, June 20th, 1914. The war, therefore, had interrupted the correspondence. Debenham had made further notes of his own in the margin here and there. Does this originate primarily from Mason's mind, communicated thence to his protégé? He agreed with his assistant's query. If so, was it transferred to Mason's mind before that? By the father or mother? The mother was, obviously his, Mason's, great love. Yet the father was his life friend. Mason's great passion was suppressed. He never told it. It found no outlet. Admirable, was the comment spoken below his breath. Boy born as result of some magical experiment intensely believed, not stated in detail, during course of which father died suddenly. Mason tended mother, then lived alone in remote place where all had occurred. Did Mason inherit entire content of parents' beliefs, dramatizing this by force of unexpressed but passionate love? Did not Mason's mind, thus charged, communicate whole business to the young mind he has since formed, a plastic mind uninfluenced by normal human surroundings and conditions of ordinary life? Transfer of a sex-inspired mania? Then followed another note, summarizing evidently Debenham's judgment. Not worth F's investigation until examined further. N.B. Look up Mason first opportunity and judge at first hand. Dr. Fillory, glancing from the papers to the portrait, smiled a little again as he signified approval. But the last entry interested him still more. It was dated July 13, 1914. Mason reports boy's prophecy of great upheaval coming. Entire race slips back into chaos of primitive life again. Entire Western civilization crumbles. Modern inventions and knowledge vanish. Nature spirits reappear. Desires return of all previous letters, these sent by registered post. A few scattered notes on separate sheets of paper lay at the end of the carefully typed dossier, but these were very incomplete, and Debenham's handwriting, especially when in pencil, was not of the clearest. Non-human claim, though absurd, not traceable to any antecedent causes given by letters. What is Mason's past mental and temperamental history? Is he not, through the parents, the cause? Mania seems harmless, both to subject and others. No suffering or unhappiness. Therefore, not a case for F, until further examined by self. Better see Mason and his subject first. Wrote July 24th, proposing visit. Dr. Fillory's eyes twinkled. His forehead relaxed. He looked back. He remembered details. Debenham's holiday that year, he recalled, was due on August 1st. He had intended going out mountain climbing in Switzerland. The final note of all, also in half-legible writing, seemed to refer to the treatment Mason had asked advice about, and the line Debenham had suggested. Natural life close to nature cannot hurt him, but I advise watch him with fire and with heights, heat, air. That is, he may decide his physical body is irksome and seek to escape it. Teach him natural history, botany, geology, insects, animals, even astronomy, but always giving him reasons and explanations. Above all, let him meet girls of his own age and fall in love. Fullest natural expression, but guarded without his knowing it. For a long time, Dr. Fillory sat with the notes and papers before him, thinking over what he had read. Debenham's advice was clever enough, but without insight, sound and astute, yet lacking divination. The twinkle in his eyes caused by the final entry died away. His face was grave, his manner preoccupied, intense. He gazed long at the portrait in his hand. It was dusk when he finally rose, replaced the dossier, locked the cabinet, and went out into another room, and thence into the hall. Taking his hat and stick, he left the house, already composing in his mind the telegram instructing Debenham, while apologizing for the interrupted holiday, to bring the subject of the notes to England with him. A telegraph girl met him on the very steps of the house. He took the envelope from her and opened it. He read the message. It was dated Bâle the day before. Arriving end week with interesting patient. Details index under Mason. Prepare private suite. Debenham. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of The Bright Messenger by Algernon Blackwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Bright Messenger. Chapter 5. It was, however, some 2 weeks later before Dr. Fillory was on his way to the station to meet Debenham and his companion. A slight delay, caused apparently by the necessity of buying an outfit, had intervened and given time for an exchange of letters, but Debenham had contented himself chiefly with telegrams. He did not wish his chief to know too much about the case in advance. Probably he regrets the notes already, thought the doctor as the car made its way slowly across crowded London. He wants my first unbiased judgment. He's right, of course, but it's too late for that now. The delay, however, had been of value. The home was in working order again, the staff returned, the private suite all ready for its interesting occupant, whom, in thought, he had already named N.H. For in the first place, he did not know his name as yet, and in the second, he felt towards him a certain attitude of tolerant, half-humorous skepticism. Cut off from his own kind for so many years, educated, perhaps half-educated only, by too speculative and imaginative a mind, equally warped by this long solitude, a mind unduly stretched by the contemplation of immense geological perspectives, filled, too, with heaven knows what strange stories of pantheistic nature-feeling, N.H. might be distinctly interesting, but hardly all that Mason had thought him. Unique was a word rarely justified. The peculiarities would prove to be mere extravagances that had, of necessity, remained uncorrected by the friction of intercourse with his own kind. The rest was inheritance, equally unpruned, a mind living in a side eddy, a backwater with nature. At the same time, Dr. Fillory admitted a certain anticipatory excitement he could not wholly account for, an undercurrent of wonder he ascribed to his Caucasian blood. He had written once only to his assistant, sending briefest instructions to say the rooms would be ready and that the young man must believe he was an invited guest coming on a visit. Let him expect complete freedom of movement and occupation without the smallest idea of restraint in any way. He is merely coming to stay for as long as he pleases with a friend of Mason. Impress him with a sense of hearty welcome. And Debenham, replying, had evidently understood the wisdom of this method. "He is greatly pleased with your name, the sound of it," was stated in one letter that he wrote, "and as names mean a lot to him, so much the better. The sound of it gives him pleasure. He keeps repeating it over to himself. He already likes you. My name he does not care about, saying it quickly, sharply. But he trusts me. His trust in anyone who shows him kindness is instantaneous and complete. He invariably expects kindness, however, from everyone, gives it himself equally, and is baffled and puzzled by any other treatment." So Debenham, with N.H., who attached importance to names and expected kindness from people as a natural thing, would be in London town within the hour. Straight from his forests and mountains for the first time in his life, he would find himself in the heart of the greatest accumulation of human beings on the planet, the first city of the world, the final expression of civilization as known to the human race. N.H. in London town, thought Dr. Fillory, his mouth twitching with the smile that began in his quiet eyes. Bless the lad, we must make him feel at home and happy. He shall indeed have kindness. He'll need a woman's touch as well. He reflected a moment. Women are a great help in doubtful cases. The way a man reacts to them, he mused, only they must be distinct in type to be of value. And his mind ran quickly, comprehensively, over the women of his acquaintance, pausing, as it did so, upon two in particular, a certain Lady Gleason and Irada, sometimes called Nyan, Kilkoff, the daughter of his Russian friend, the sculptor. His mind pondered for some moments the two he had selected. It was not the first time he had made use of them. Their effect respectively upon a man was invariably instinctive and illuminating. The two were radically different feminine types, as far removed from one another as pole from pole, yet each essentially of her sex. Their effect, respectively, upon such a youth must be of value, and might be even illuminating to the point of revelation. Both, he felt sure, would not be indifferent to the new personality. It was, however, of Nyan Kilkoff that he thought chiefly, of that rare, selfless, maternal type which men in all ages have called saint or angel. She possessed that power which evoked in them all they could feel of respect, of purity, of chivalry, that love, in a word, which holds as a chief ingredient worship. Her beauty, beyond their reach, was of the stars. It was the unattainable in her they loved. Her beauty was of the soul. Nyan was spiritual, not as a result of painful effort and laborious development, but born so. Her life, moreover, was one of natural service. Personal love, exclusive devotion to an individual, concentration of her being upon another single being, this seemed impossible to her. She was at the same time an enigma. There was an elusive flavor about her that made people a little in awe of her, a flavor not of this earth quite. She carried an impersonal attitude almost to the point of seeming irresponsive to common human things and interests. The other woman, Lady Gleason, Angela her Christian name, was equally a simple type, though her simplicity was that of the primitive female who was still close to the Stone Age, a savage. She adorned herself to capture men. She was the female spider that devours its mates. She wanted slaves. To describe her as selfish were inadequate, for she was unaware that any other ideal existed in life but that of obtaining her own pleasure. There was instinct and emotion, but, of course, no heart. Without morals, conscience, or consideration, she was the animal of prey that obeys the call of hunger in the most direct way possible, regardless of consequences to herself or others. Her brain was quick, her personality shallow. When talking, she rattled on. Debenham had well said once, "You can hear her two thoughts clicking, both of them in trousers." Sir George, recently knighted, successful with large concessions in China, was indulgent. The male splendor of the youth was bound to stimulate her hunger, as his simplicity, his loneliness, and in a sense his pathetic helplessness, would certainly evoke the tenderness in Nyan. "He'll probably like her. Ridiculous name, too," Dr. Fillory felt. "The nickname they gave her because she's the same to everybody, whichever way you take her. Nyan Kilcoff." Yet her real name was more beautiful, Ireda. And as he repeated it half aloud, a soft light stole upon his face, shone in the deep, clear eyes, and touched even the corners of the rather grim mouth with another, a tenderer expression, before the sternness quickly returned to it. N.H. would meet thus two main types of female life. He apparently, an exceedingly male being, would face the onslaught of passion and heart, of lust and love respectively. And it was his reactions to these onslaughts that Fillory wished to observe. They would help his diagnosis. They might guide his treatment. It was a warm and muggy afternoon, the twilight passing rapidly into darkness now, one of those late autumn days when summer heat flits back, but light is weak. The covered sky increased the clammy warmth, which was damp, unhealthy, devitalizing. No wind stirred. The great city was sticky and depressing. Yet people approved the heat, although it tired them. "It shortens the winter, anyhow," was the general verdict when expressed at all. They referred unconsciously to the general dread of strikes. London was hurried and confused. An air of feverish overcrowding reigned in the great station when he left the car and went in on foot. No sign of order, system, direction was visible. The scene might have been a first rehearsal of some entirely new experiment. Grumbling and complaint rose from all sides in an exasperated chorus. He tried to ascertain how late the train was and on which platform it might be expected, but no one knew for certain, and the grudging replies to questions seemed to say, "You've no right to ask anything, and if you keep on asking, there will be a strike. So that's that." He listened to the talk and watched the facial expressions and the movements of the half-resigned and half-excited concourse of London citizens. The clock was accurate, and everyone was kind to ladies. Stewed tea, stale cake with little stones in it, vile whiskey, and very weak beer were obtainable at high prices. There were no matches. The machine for supplying the platform tickets was broken. He saw men paying more thought and attention to the comfort of their dogs than to their own. The great, marvelous, stupid, splendid race was puzzled and exasperated. Then suddenly the train pulled in, full of returned exiles longing to be back again in dear old England.
"Thank God it's come," sighed the crowd. "Good, we're English. Forgive and forget," and prepared to tip the porters handsomely and carry their own baggage.
The confusion that followed was equally characteristic and equally remarkable, displaying greatness side by side with its defects. There was no system, all was muddled, yet all was safe. Anyone could claim what luggage they liked, though no one did so, nor dreamed, it seemed, of doing so. There was an air of decent honesty and trust. There were ladies who discovered that all men are savages. There were men and women who were savages. People shook hands warmly, smiled with honest affection, said light, careless goodbyes that hid genuine emotion, helped one another with parcels, offered one another lifts. There were few taxicabs, one perhaps to every 30 people. And in this general scrimmage, Dr. Fillory at first could see no sign of his expected arrivals. He walked from end to end of the platform, littered with luggage and thronged with bustling people, but nowhere could he discover the familiar outline of Debenham, nor anyone who answered to the strange picture that already stood forth sharply in his mind. "There has been a mistake somewhere," he said to himself. "I shall find a telegram when I get back to the house explaining it." When suddenly, and without apparent cause, there stole upon him a curious lift of freedom, a sharp sense of open spaces he was at a loss to understand. It was accompanied by an increase of light. For a second it occurred to him that the great enclosing roof had rolled back and blown away, letting in air and some lost ray of sunshine. A lovely valley flitted across his thought. Almost he was aware of flowers, of music, of rhythmic movement. "Edward, there you are. I thought you hadn't come," he heard close behind him, and turning, saw the figure of Debenham, calm and alert as usual. At his side stood a lean, virile outline of a young man, topping Debenham by several inches, with broad but thin shoulders, figure erect yet flexible, whose shining and inquiring eyes of blue were the most striking feature in a boyish face, where strength, intensity, and radiant health combined in an unusual degree. "Here is our friend La Valonne," added Debenham, but not before the figure had stepped lightly and quickly forward, already staring at him and shaking his outstretched hand. So this was N.H., and La Valonne was his name. The calm, searching eyes held a touch of bewilderment in them, the eyes of an honest, intelligent animal, thought Fillory quickly, adding in spite of himself and almost simultaneously, but of a divine animal. It was a look he had never in his life before encountered in any human eyes. Mason's watercolor sketch had caught something, at least, of their innocence and question, of their odd directness and intensity, something, too, of the golden fire in the hair. He wore a broad-brimmed felt hat of Swiss pattern, a Bernese overcoat, and a low, soft-collared shirt with blue tie to match. Buffeted and pushed by the frenzied travelers, they stood and faced each other, shaking hands, eyes looking into eyes, two strangers, doctor and patient possibly, but friends most certainly, both felt instantly. They liked one another. Once again the scent of flowers danced with light above the piled-up heaps of trunks, rugs, packages. A cool wind from mountains seemed to blow across the dreadful station. "You've arrived safely," began Dr. Fillory, a little taken aback, perhaps. "Welcome, and not too tired, I hope," when the other interrupted him in a man's deep voice, full of pleasant timbre. "Fillory," he said, making the F sound rather long. "I need you. To see you makes me happy." "Tired," put in Devon breathlessly. "Good heavens, not he. But I am. Now for a porter and the big luggage. Have you got a taxi?"
"The car is here," said Fillory, letting go with a certain reluctance the hand he held, and paying little attention to anything but the figure before him who used such unexpected language. What was it? What did it mean? Whence came this sudden sense of intensity, light, of order, system, intelligence into the racial scene of muddled turmoil all about him? There seemed an air of speeding up in thought and action near him, compared to which the slow stupidity, uncoordinated and confused on all sides, became painful, gross, and even ludicrous. Someone bumped against him with violence, but quite needlessly, since the simplest judgment of weight and distance could have avoided the collision. In such ordinary small details he was aware of another, a higher standard close. A man on his left, trying to manage several bundles, appeared vividly as of amazing incompetence, with his miscalculation, his clumsy movement, his hopeless inability to judge cause and effect. Yet he had 2 arms, 10 fingers, 2 legs, broad shoulders, and deep chest. Misdirection of his great strength made it impossible for him to manage the assortment of light parcels. Next to him, however, stood a woman carrying a baby. There was no error there. The panting engine just beyond them, again, set a standard of contemptuous, impersonal intelligence that, obeying nature's laws, dwarfed the humans generally. But it was another, a quasi-spiritual standard that had flashed to him above all. In some curious way, the competent dead machinery that obeyed the law with faultless efficiency, and the woman obeying instinct with equally unconscious skill, these 2 energies were akin to the new standard he was now startlingly aware of. He looked up as though to trace this sudden new consciousness of bright, quick, rapid competence, almost as of some immense power building with consistent scheme and system, that had occurred to him, and he met again the direct yet slightly bewildered eyes that watched him with a confidence, sweetness, and with a questioning intensity he found intriguing, captivating, and oddly stimulating. He felt happiness. "By your leave!" roared a porter as they stepped aside just in time to save being pushed by the laden truck. Just in time to save himself, that is, for the other, Fillory noticed, moved like a chamois on its native rocks, so surely, lightly, swiftly was he poised. You must excuse it," the doctor exclaimed with a smile of apology almost. "We've not yet had time to settle down after the war, you see." He pointed with a sweep of his hand to the roaring, dim-lit cavern where confusion reigned supreme, the GHQ of travel in the biggest city of the Empire. "I've got a porter," cried Debenham, beckoning vigorously a little further down the platform. "You wait there. I'll be along in a minute with the stuff." He was hot, flustered, exhausted. "You struggle. It was like this all the way. Is there no knowledge?" Le Vallon asked in his deep, quiet tones. "We do," said Fillory. "With us, life is always struggle. But there is more system than appears. The confusion is chiefly on the surface." "It is dark, and there is so little air," observed the other, "and they all work against each other." Fillory laughed into the other's eyes. They laughed together, and it seemed suddenly to the doctor that their beings somehow merged, so that for a second he knew the entire content of his companion's mind, as if there was nothing in Le Vallon he did not understand. "You are a builder," Le Vallon said abruptly. But as he said it, his companion caught, on the wing as it were, another meaning. He became curiously aware of the smallness, of the remote insignificance of the little planet whereon this dialogue took place, yet at the same time of its superb seductive loveliness. In him rose a feeling, as on wings, that he was not chained in his familiar, daily personality, but that an immense, delicious freedom lay within reach. He could be everywhere at once,
He could do everything.
"Wait here while I help Debenham. Then we'll get into the car and be off." He moved away, threading a path with difficulty.
"I wait in peace. I am happy," was the reply. And with those few phrases, uttered in the quiet, deep voice, sounding in his ears and in his very blood, the older man went towards the spot where Debenham struggled with a porter, a pile of nondescript luggage and a truck. "I wait in peace. You struggle, you work against each other. It is dark, there is little air. You are a builder." But not these singular words alone remained alive in his mind. There remained in his heart the sense of that vitality of open spaces, keen air, and brighter light he had experienced, and with it the security of some higher, faultless standard. His brain, indeed, had recognized a consciousness of swifter reactions, of surer movements, of more intelligent coordination, compared to which the people about him behaved like stupid, almost like half-witted beings, the one exception being the instinctive action of the mother in carrying her baby, and the other the impersonal, accurate competence of the dead machinery. But more than this reasoned change, there burned suddenly in his heart an inexplicable exhilaration and brightness, a wonder that he could attribute only to another mode of life. His Caucasian blood, he knew, might be responsible for part of it, but not for all. The invigorating mountain wind, the sunlight, the rhythmic sound, the scent of wildflowers, these were his own personal interpretations of a quickened sense he could not analyze as yet. As he held the young man's hand, as he gazed into his direct blue eyes, this sense had increased in intensity. Le Vallon had some marvelous quality or power that was new to him, while yet not entirely unfamiliar. What was it? And how did the youth perceive this sense in him so surely that he took its presence for granted, accepted, even played upon it? He experienced, as it were, a brilliant intensification of spirit. Some portion of him already knew exactly what La Vallon was. Across the ugly turmoil and confusion of the huge, dingy railway terminus had moved wondrously some simple power that brought in beauty, some very deep and ancient conception that touched him and gone its way again. The stupendous beauty of a simple, common day appeared to him. His subconscious being, of course, was deeply stirred. That was the truth, phrase it as he might. His heart was lifted, as by a primal wind at dawn upon some mountain top. The heaviness of the day was gone. Fatigue, too, vanished. The civilized folk appeared contemptible and stupid. Something direct from nature herself poured through him. And it was from the atmosphere of La Vallon this new vitality issued radiating. He found a moment or two, while alone with Debenham, to exchange a few hurried sentences. As they bent over bags and bundles, he asked quick questions. These questions and answers between the two experienced men were brief but significant. "Yes, quiet as a lamb. Just be kind and sympathetic. You looked up the notes? Well, that can't be helped now, though I had rather you knew nothing. My mistake, of course. The content of his mind is accessible to me, telepathically, in any case. But at one remove more distant, because unexpressed." Fillory laughed. "Quite right. I admit it's a pity. But tell me more about him, anything I ought to know at once." "Quiet as a lamb, I told you," repeated the other. "And most of the way over, too. But puzzled. My God, Edward, his criticisms would make a book." "Normal, intelligent criticisms?" "Intelligent above ordinary. Normal, no." "Hysteria?" "Not a sign." "Health?" "Perfect. Magnificent, as you see. He's less tired now than when we started 3 days ago, whereas I'm fagged out, though in climbing condition." Origin of delusions? Any indication?" Debenham looked up quickly. His eyes flashed a peculiarly searching glance, something watchful in it, perhaps. "No delusion at all of any sort. As for origin of his ideas, the parents probably, but stimulated and allowed unchecked growth by Mason. Affected by nature beyond anything we know." By nature? Ah. He checked himself. "And what peculiarities?" he asked. "His terror of water, for instance. Crossing the channel, he was like a frightened child. He hid from it, kept his hands over his eyes even, so as not to see it." "Give any reason?" "All he said was, 'It is unknown, an enemy, and can destroy me. I cannot understand its secret ways. Fire and wind are not in it. I cannot work with it.' No, it was not fear of drowning that he meant. He found comfort, too, in the repetition of your name." "Appetite, pulse, temperature?" asked Fillory after a brief pause. "First two very strong. Temperature always slightly above normal." "Other peculiarities?" "He became rather excited before a lighted match once. Tried to kneel almost, but I stopped it." "Fire?" "That's it. Instinct of worship, presumably." The barrow was laden. The porter was asking where the car was. They prepared to move back to the companion, whom Fillory had never failed to observe carefully over his shoulder during this rapid conversation. N.H. had not moved the whole time. He stood quietly, looking about him, a curious figure, aloof somehow from his surroundings. So tall and straight and unconcerned he seemed, yet so poised, alert, virile, vigorous. It was not his clothes that made him appear unusual, nor was it his eyes and hair alone, though all three contributed their share. Yet he seemed dressed up, his clothes irksome to him. He was uncommon, an attractive figure, and many pair of eyes, female eyes especially, Fillory noticed, turned to examine him with undeniable curiosity. "And women?" the doctor asked quickly in a lowered voice, as they followed the porter's barrow towards La Valonne, who already smiled at their approach, the most engaging, trustful, welcoming smile that Fillory had ever seen upon a human countenance. He lowered his head to catch the reply, but Debenham only laughed and shrugged his shoulders. "All attracted," he mumbled in a half-whisper, "and eager to help him." "And he?" "Gentle, astonished, but indifferent. Oh, supremely indifferent." La Valonne came forward to meet them, and Fillory took his hand and led him to the car. The luggage was bundled in, some behind and some on the roof. Fillory and La Valonne sat side by side. The car started. "We shall get home in half an hour," the doctor mentioned, turning to his companion. "We'll have a good dinner and then get to bed. You are hungry, I know." "Thank you," was the reply. "Thank you, dear Fillory. I want sleep most. Will there be trees and air near me, and stars to see?" "Your windows open onto a garden with big trees. There will be plenty of fresh air, and you will hear the sparrows chattering at dawn. But London, of course, is not the country. Oh, we'll make you comfortable, never fear." "Dear Fillory, I thank you," said La Valonne quietly, and without more ado lay back among the soft cushions and closed his eyes. Hardly a word was said the whole way to the northwest suburb, and when they arrived the patient was too overcome with sleep to wish to eat. He went straight to his room, found a hot bath into which he tumbled first, and then leapt into his bed and was sound asleep almost before the door was closed. Upon a table beside the bed, Dr. Fillory, with his own hands, arranged bread, butter, eggs, and a jug of milk in case of need. Nurse Robbins, an experienced, tactful young woman, he put in special charge. He thought of everything, divining his friend's possible needs instinctively, noticing with his keen practiced eye several details for himself at the same time. The splendid physical condition, framework, muscular development, he noted. no freakish bulky masses produced by gymnastic exercises, but the muscles laid on flowingly, smooth and firm and ample, without a trace of fat, and the whole in the most admirable proportion possible. The leanness was deceptive. The body was of immense power. The quick, certain, unerring movements he noticed too. Perfect, swift coordination between brain and physical response. No misdirection, no miscalculation. The reactions extremely rapid. He thought with a smile of something between deer and tiger. The poise and balance and accuracy conveyed intense joy of living. Yet above and beyond these was something else he could not name, something that stirred in him wonder, love, a touch of awe, and a haunting suggestion of familiarity. He saw him into bed, he saw him actually asleep. The strong blue eyes looked up into his own with their intense and innocent gaze for a moment. He held the firm, dry, muscular hand. 10 seconds later, the eyes were closed in sleep. The grip of the powerful but slender fingers relaxed. "Good night, my friend, and sleep deeply. Tomorrow we'll see to everything you need. Be happy here and comfortable with us, for you are welcome and we love you." His voice trembled slightly. "Good night, dear Filori," the musical tones replied, and he was off. The windows were wide open. N.H. had thrown aside the pajamas and blankets. On this cool, damp night of late autumn he covered his big, warm, lithe body with a single sheet only. Fillory went out quietly, an expression of keen approval and enjoyment on his face. Not a smile exactly, but that look of deep content, betraying a fine inner excitement of happiness, which is the mother of all smiles. As he softly opened the door, the draught blew through from the open windows, stirring the white curtains by the bed. It came from the big, damp garden where the trees stood, already nearly leafless, and where no flowers were. And yet a scent of flowers came faintly with it. He caught an echo of faint sound, like music. There was the invigorating hint of forest, too. It seemed a living wind that blew into the house. Dr. Fillory paused a moment, sniffed with surprise and sharp enjoyment, listened intently, then switched the light off and went out, closing the door behind him. There was a flash of wonder in his eyes, and a thrill of some remote, inexplicable happiness ran through his nerves. An instant of complete comprehension had been his, as if another consciousness had, for that swift instant, identified itself with his own. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The Bright Messenger by Algernon Blackwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Bright Messenger. Chapter 6. Edward Fillory was glad that Paul Debenham, good friend and skillful colleague, was his assistant. For Debenham, competent as himself in knowledge and experience, found explanations for all things, and had in his natural temperament a quality of sane judgment which corrected extravagances. Debenham was agnostic, because reason ruled his life. Devoid of imagination, he had no temptations. Speculative, within limits, he might be, but he belonged not to the unstable. Not that he thought he knew everything, but that he refused to base action on what he regarded as unknown. A clue into the unknown he would follow up as keenly, carefully, as Fillory himself, but he went step by step, with caution, declining to move further until the last step was of hardened concrete. To the powers of subconscious self he set drastic limits, admitting their existence, of course, but attaching small value to their use or development. His own deeper being had never stirred or wakened. Of this undersea, this vast background in himself, he remained placidly uninformed. A comprehensive view of a problem, the flash of vision he never knew, thus was perhaps denied him, but so far as he went he was very safe and sure. And his chief was the first to appreciate his value. He appreciated it particularly now, as the two men sat smoking after their late dinner, discussing details of the new inmate of the home. Fillory, aware of the strong pull upon his own mixed blood, aware of a half-wild instinctive sympathy towards N.H., almost of a natural desire now, having seen him, to believe him unique in several ways, and therefore conscious of a readiness to accept more than any evidence yet justified. Feeling these symptoms clearly, and remembering vividly his experiences in the railway station, he was glad, for truth's sake, that Debenham was there to clip extravagance before it injured judgment. A weak man, aware of his own frailties, excels a stronger one who thinks he has none at all. The two colleagues were a powerful combination. "In your view, it's merely a case of a secondary, anyhow of a divided personality?" he asked, as soon as the other had recovered a little from his journey and was digesting his meal comfortably over a pipe. "You have seen more of him than I have. Of insanity, at any rate, there is no sign at all, I take it? His relations with his environment are sound?" "None whatever," Debenham answered both questions at once. "Exactly." He took off his pince-nez, cleaned them with his handkerchief, and then replaced them carefully. This gave him time to reflect, as though he was not quite sure where to begin his story. "There are certainly indications," he went on slowly, "of a divided personality, though of an unusual kind. The margin between the two, between the normal and the secondary self, is so very slight. It is not clearly defined, I mean. They sometimes merge and interpenetrate. The frontier is almost indistinguishable." Fillory raised his eyebrows. "You feel uncertain which is the main self and which the split-off secondary personality?" he inquired, with surprise. Debenham nodded. "I'm extremely puzzled," he admitted. "Levallois's most marked self, the best defined, the richest, the most fully developed, seems to me what we should call his secondary self, this nature being that worships wind and fire, is terrified by a large body of water, is ignorant of human ways, probably also quite unmoral, yet alive with a kind of instinctive wisdom we credit usually to the animal kingdom, though far beyond anything animals can claim." "Briefly, what we mean by the term N.H., suggested Fillory, not anxious for too many details at the moment. "Exactly. And I propose we always refer to that aspect of him as N.H., the other, the normal ordinary man, being Levallois, his right name." He smiled faintly. "Agreed," replied his chief. "We shall always know, then, exactly which one we're talking of at a given moment. Now," he went on, "to come to the chief point, and before you give me details of what happened abroad, let me hear your own main conclusion. What is Levallois? What is N.H.? Debenham hesitated for some time. It was evident his respect for his chief made him cautious. There was an eternal battle between these two, keen though always good-natured, even humorous, the victory not invariably perhaps with the assistant. Later evidence had often proved Fillory's swifter imagination correct after all, or, alternately, shown him to be wrong. They kept an accurate score of the points won and lost by either. "You can always revise your conclusions later," Fillory reminded him slyly. "Call it a preliminary conclusion for the moment. You've not had time yet for a careful study, I know." But Debenham this time did not smile at the rally, and his chief noticed it with secret approval. Here was something new, big, serious, it seemed. Debenham apparently was already too interested to care who scored or did not score. His notes of 1914 indeed betrayed his genuine zeal sufficiently. "Le Vallon," he said at length, "to begin with him. I think Le Vallon, without any flavor of NH, is a fine specimen of a normal human being. His physique is magnificent, as you have seen, his health and strength exceptional. The brain, so far as I have been able to judge, functions quite normally. The intelligence, also normal, is much above the average in quickness, receptivity of ideas, and judgment based on these. The emotional development, however, puzzles me. The emotions are not entirely normal, but—" He paused again, a grave expression on his face. "To answer your question as well as my limited observation of him, of Le Vallon, allows, I repeat that I consider him a normal young man, though with peculiarities and idiosyncrasies of his own, as with most other normal young fellows who are individuals. That is," he added quickly, "and not turned out in bundles cut to measure." So much for Le Vallon. Now what about NH? He repeated the question, fixing the assistant with his steady gaze. He had noticed the confusion in the reply. "My dear Edward," began Debenham, after a considerable pause. Then he stuck fast, sighed, settled his glasses carefully upon his aquiline, sharp nose, and relapsed into silence. His forehead became wrinkled, his mouth much pursed. "Out with it, Paul. This isn't a court of law. I shan't behead you if you're wrong." Yet Fillory, too, spoke gravely. The other kept his eyes down. His face still wore a puzzled look. Fillory detected a new expression on the keen, thoughtful features, and he was pleased to see it. "To give you the truth," resumed his assistant, "and all question of who is right or who is wrong aside, I tell you frankly, I am not sure. I confess myself up against it. It gives me the creeps a little." He laughed awkwardly. That swift, watchful look, as of a man who plays a part, flashed and vanished. "Your feeling, anyhow?" insisted his friend. "Your general feeling?" "A general judgment based on general feeling," said the other in a quiet tone, "has little value. It is based, necessarily, as you know, upon intuition, which I, temperamentally, dislike. It has no facts to go upon. I distrust generalizations." He took a deep breath, inhaled a lot of smoke, exhaled it with relief, and made an effort. It went against the grain in him to be caught without an explanation. "NH, in my opinion, and so far as my limited observation of him—" Fillory allowed himself a laugh of amused impatience. "Leave out the personal extras for once and burn your bridges. Tell me finally what you think about NH. We're not scoring points now." Thus, faced with an alternative, Debenham found his sense of humor again and forgot himself. It cost him an effort, but he obeyed the bigger and less personal mind. "I really don't know exactly what he is," he confessed again. "He puzzles me completely. It may be—" he shrugged his shoulders, compelled by his temperament to hedge— "that he represents, as I first thought, the content of his parents' minds, the subsequent addition of Mason's mind included." "That's possible, usual, and comprehensible enough," put in the doctor, watching him with amused concentration, but with an inner excitement scarcely concealed. "Or," resumed Debenham, "it may be that through his mental inheritance from his parents and from Mason, yes, he taps the most primitive stores and layers of racial memory we know. The world memory, if I dare put it so, full proof being lacking, is open to him. Through his subconscious powers, of course. That is your usual theory, isn't it? We have there, at any rate, a working hypothesis, with a great mass of evidence, generally speaking, behind it. Don't be cynical, Paul. Is this NH merely a secondary personality, or is it the real central self? That's the whole point. You jump ahead as usual, replied Debenham, really smiling for the first time, though his face instantly grew serious again. Edward, he went on, I do not know, I cannot say, I dare not guess. NH is something entirely new to me, and I admit it. He seemed to find his stride, to forget himself. I feel far from cynical. NH, in my opinion, is exceptional. My notes suggested it long ago. He has, for instance, at least so it seems to me, peculiar powers. Ah, of suggestion, let us put it. Of suggestion, yes. Get on with it, there's a good fellow. I felt myself an extraordinary vitality about him. I noticed it at once at Charing Cross. I saw you did. Debenham looked hard at him. You were humming to yourself, you know. I didn't know, was the surprised reply. But I can well believe it. I felt a curious pleasure and exhilaration. Debenham, shrugging his shoulders slightly, resumed. During the La Vallon periods he is ordinary, though unusually observant, critical, and intelligent. During the NH periods he becomes, supernormal. If you felt this, felt anything in the station, it was because something in you called up the NH aspect. It's quick of you to guess that, said Fillory, with quick appreciation. You noticed a change in me. Well, but the other? He divined my foreign blood, you think? It is enough that you responded and felt kinship. Put it that way. NH seems to me— He took a deeper breath and gave a sort of gasp. In some ways, a unique being, as I said before. Tell me, if you can, said Fillory, lighting his own pipe and settling back into his chair. Tell me a little about your first meeting with him in the Jura Mountains, what happened and so forth. I remember, of course, your notes. After your telegram, I read 'em carefully. He glanced round at his companion. They were very honest, Paul, I thought, eh? He was unable to refuse himself the pleasure of the little dig. Honest you always are, he added. We couldn't work together otherwise, could we? Debenham, deep in his own thoughts, did not accept the challenge. He turned in his chair, puffing at his pipe. I can give you briefly what happened and how things went, he said. The place, then, first. An ordinary peasant chalet in a remote Jura valley, difficult of access, situated among what they call the upper pastures. I reached it by diligence and mule late in the afternoon. A peasant in a lower valley directed me, adding that Le Monsieur Anglais was dead and buried 2 days before. Mason, that is? The other nodded. And adding that Le Fou, La Vallon, of course, would eat me alive at sight. He spoke with respect, however, even awe. He hoped I would come to take him away. The countryside was afraid of him. The valley struck me as intolerably lonely, but of unusual beauty. Big forests, great rocks, and tumbling streams among cliffs and pastures made it exceptional. The chalet was simple, clean, and comfortable. It was really an ideal spot for a thinker or a student. The first thing I noticed was a fire burning on a pile of rock in front of the building. The sun was setting, and its last rays lit the entire little glen, a mere gully between precipices and forest slopes, but especially lit up the pile of rocks where the fire burned, so that I saw the smoke, blue, red, and yellow, and the figure kneeling before it. This figure was a man, half naked, and of magnificent proportions. When I shouted, You would shout, of course. Yet he did not say it critically. The figure rose and turned and came to meet me. It was La Valonne. Debenham paused a moment. Fillory's eyes were fixed upon him. "I admit," Debenham went on, conscious of the other's inquiring and intent expression, "I was surprised a bit." He smiled his faint, unwilling smile. "The figure made me start. I was aware of an emotion I am not subject to, what I called just now the creeps. I thought, at last, I had really seen a vision. He looked so huge, so wonderful, so radiant. It was, of course, the effect of the colored smoke and magnifying sunset added to his semi-nakedness. To the waist he was stripped. But at first his size, his splendor, a kind of radiance borrowed from the sunlight and the fire, seemed to enlarge him beyond human. He seemed to dominate, even to fill the little valley. I stood still, uncertain of my feelings. There was, I think, a trace of fear in me. I waited for him to come up to me. He did so. He stretched out a hand. I took it. And what do you think he said?" Fillory, the inner excitement and delight increasing in him as he listened, stared in silence. There was no lightness in him now. "Are you Fillory?" That's what he said, and the first words he uttered. "Are you Fillory?" But spoken in a way I find difficult to reproduce. He made the name sound like a rush of wind. F, of course, involves a draught of breath between the teeth, I know, but he made the name sound exactly like a gush of wind through branches. That's the nearest I can get to it." "Well, and then?" "Don't be impatient, Edward. I try to be accurate. But really, what happened next is a bit beyond any experience that I, have yet come across. And as to what I felt, well, I was tired, hungry, thirsty. I wanted, normally, rest and food and drink. Yet all these were utterly forgotten. For a moment or two, I admit it, I felt as if I had come face to face with something not of this earth quite." He grinned. "A touch of goose-flesh came to me for the first time in my life. The fellow's size and radiance in the sunlight, the fact that he stood there worshipping fire, always to me the most wonderful of natural phenomena, his grandeur and nakedness, the way he pronounced your name even, all this upset my judgment for the moment." He paused again. He hesitated. "A visual hallucination, due to fatigue, can be, of course, very detailed sometimes," he added, a note of challenge in his tone. Fillory watched his friend narrowly as he stumbled among the details of what he evidently found a difficult, almost an impossible description. "Natural enough," he put in. "You'd hardly be human yourself if you felt nothing at such a sight." "The loneliness, too, increased the effect," went on the other, "for there was no one nearer than the peasants who had directed me 1,000 feet below, nor was there another building of any sort in sight. Anyhow, it seemed I managed my strange emotions all right, for the young man took to me at once. He left the fire, if reluctantly, singing to himself a sort of low chanting melody, with perhaps 5 or 6 notes at most in it, and far from unmusical." "He explained the fire? Was he actually worshipping, I mean?" "It was certainly worship, judging by the expression of his face and his gestures of reverence and happiness. But I asked no questions. I thought it best just to accept, or appear to accept, the whole thing as natural. He said something about the equinox, but I did not catch it properly and did not ask. This had evidently been taught him. It was, however, the 22nd of September, oddly enough, though the gales had not yet come. "So you got into the chalet next?" asked the other, noticing the gaps, the incoherence. He put his coat on, sat down with me to a meal of bread and milk and cheese. Meat there seemed none in the building anywhere. This meal was, if you understand me, obeying a mere habit automatically. He did just what it had been his habit to do with Mason all these years. He got the stuff himself, quickly, effectively, no fumbling anywhere, and from that moment hardly spoke again until we left 2 days later. I mean that literally. All he said, when I tried to make him talk, was, "You are not Fillory," or "Take me to Fillory, I need him." I almost felt that I was living with some marvelously trained animal, of extraordinary intelligence, gentle, docile, friendly, but unhappy, because it had lost its accustomed master. But, on the other hand, I admit it, I was conscious of a certain power in his personality beyond me to explain. That, really, is the best description I can give you. "You mentioned the name of Mason?" asked Fillory, avoiding a dozen more obvious and natural questions. "Several times, but his only reply was a smile, while he repeated the name himself, adding your own after it. Mason Fillory, Mason Fillory, he would say, smiling with quiet happiness. I like Fillory." "The nights?" "Briefly, I was glad to see the dawn. We had separate rooms, my own being the one probably where Mason had died a few days before. But it was not that I minded in the least. It was the feeling, the knowledge, in fact, that my companion was up and about all night, in the building or out of doors. I heard him moving, singing quietly to himself. The wooden veranda creaked beneath his tread. He was active all through the darkness and cannot have slept at all. When I came down soon after dawn, he was running over the slopes a mile away, running towards the chalet, too, with the speed and lightness of a deer. He had been to some height, I think, to see the sun rise, and probably to worship it." "And your journey? You got him away easily?" "He was only too ready to leave, for it meant coming to you. I arranged with the peasants below to have the chalet closed up, took my charge to Neuchâtel, and thence to Berne, where I bought him an outfit, and arrived in due course, as you know, at Charing Cross." "His first sight of cities, people, trains, steamers, and the rest, I take it. Any reactions?" "The troubles I anticipated did not materialize. He came like a lamb, the most helpless and pathetic lamb I ever saw. He stared, but asked no questions. I think he was half-dazed, even stupefied with it all." "Stupefied?" "An odd word to use, I know. I should have said perhaps automatic, rather. He was so open to my suggestions, doing what my mind expected him to do, but nothing more. With one exception." Fillory meant to hear an account of that exception, though the other would willingly have foregone its telling evidently. It was related, Fillory felt sure, to the unusual powers Debenham had mentioned. "Oh, you shall hear it," said the latter quickly, "for what it's worth. There's no need to exaggerate, of course." He told it rapidly, accurately no doubt, because his mind was honest, yet without comment or expression in his voice and face. He supplied no atmosphere. "I had got him like a lamb, as I told you, to Paris, and it was during the customs examination the little thing occurred. The man, searching through his trunk, pulled out a packet of flat papers and opened it. He looked them over with puzzled interest, turning them upside down to examine them from every possible angle. Then he asked a trifle unpleasantly what they were. I hadn't the smallest idea myself. I had never seen them before. They were very carefully wrapped up. Levallois, whose sudden excitement increased the official's interest, told him that they were star and weather maps. It doubtless was the truth. He had made them with Mason. But they were queer-looking papers to have at such a time, hidden away, too, at the bottom of the trunk, and Lavallon's manner and expression did not help to disarm the man's evident suspicion. He asked a number of pointed questions in a very disagreeable way: who made them, for what purpose, how they were used, and whether they were connected with aviation. I translated, of course. I explained their innocence. "Lavallon's excitement?" asked Fillory. "What form did it take? Rudeness, anger, violence of any sort?" He was aware his friend would have liked to shirk these details. "Nothing of the kind." He hesitated briefly, then went on. "He behaved rather as though, well, as a devout Catholic might have behaved if his crucifix or some holy relic were being mauled. The maps were sacred, symbols possibly, heaven knows what. He tried to take them back. The official, as a natural result, became still more suspicious, and, of course, offensive too. My explanations and expostulations were quite useless, for he didn't even listen to them." Debenham was now approaching the part of the story he least wished to describe. He played for time. He gave details of the ensuing altercation. "What happened in the end?" Fillory at length interrupted. "What did Lavallon do? There were no arrests, I take it," he added with a smile. Paul coughed and fidgeted. He told the literal truth, however. Lavallon, after listening for a long time to the conversation he could not understand, suddenly took his fingers off the papers. The man's dirty hand still held them tightly on the grimy counter. Lavallon he suddenly began to breathe, well, heavily, rather. "Rhythmically?" "Heavily," insisted the other. "In a curious way, anyhow," he added, determined to keep strictly to the truth. "Not unlike Heathcote when he put himself automatically into trance and then told us what was going on at the other end of England. You remember the case." He paused a moment again, as if to recall exactly what had occurred. "It's not easy to describe, Edward," he continued, looking up. "You remember that huge draughty hall where they examined luggage at the Lyons station? I can't explain it, but that breathing somehow caught the draughts, used them possibly, in any case increased them. A wind came through the great hall. I can't explain it," he repeated. "I can only tell you what happened. That wind most certainly came pouring steadily through, for I felt it myself, and saw it blow upon the fluttering papers. The heat in the salle at the same moment seemed to grow intense. Not an oppressive heat, though, radiant heat, rather. It felt, like fierce sunlight. I looked up, almost expecting to see a great light from which it came. It was then, at this very moment, the Frenchman turned as if someone touched him." "You felt anything, Paul?" "Yes," admitted the other slowly. Fillory waited. What I must call a thrill." His voice was lower now. "Of?" his chief persisted. Debenham waited a full 10 seconds before reply. He again shrugged his shoulders a little. Apparently, he sought his words with honest care that included also intense reluctance and disapproval. "Loveliness, romance, enchantment. But, above all, I think, power." He ground out the confession slowly. "By power, I mean a sort of confidence and happiness." "Increase of vitality, call it. Intensification of your consciousness." "Possibly. A bigger perspective suddenly. A bigger scale of life. Something, a bit wild, but certainly, uncommonly stimulating. The best word, I think, is liberty, perhaps. An immense and careless sense of liberty." And Fillory, knowing the value of superlatives in Debenham's cautious mind, felt satisfied. He asked quietly what the official did next. stood stock still at first. Then his face changed. He smiled. He looked up understandingly, sympathetically, at Levalloon. He spoke. "My father, too," he said with admiration, "had a big telescope. Monsieur is an astronomer." "One of the greatest," I added quickly. "These charts are of infinite value to France." No sense of comedy touched me anywhere. The ludicrous was absent. The man bowed, as carefully, respect in every gesture. He replaced the maps, marked the trunk with his piece of chalk, and let us go, helping in every way he could. Debenham drew a long breath, glad that he had relieved himself of his unwelcome duty. He had told the literal truth. Of course," Fillory said, half to himself perhaps. A breath of bigger consciousness, his imagination touched, the subconscious wakened, and intelligence the natural result. He turned to his colleague. "Interesting, Paul, very," he added in a louder tone. "And not easy to explain, I grant. The official we do not know, but you, at any rate, are not a good subject for hypnotic suggestion." For some time Debenham said nothing. Presently he spoke. "Fillory, I tell you, really, I love the fellow. He's the most lovable thing in human shape I ever saw. He gets into your heart so strangely. We must heal him." The other sighed, quickly smothering it, yet not before Debenham had noticed it. They did not look at one another for some seconds, and there was a certain tenseness, a sense of deep emotion in the air that each, possibly, sought to hide from the other. Debenham was the first to break the silence that had fallen between them. "To be quite frank, it's Levalloon that appeals most to me," he said, as if to himself. "Whereas you, Edward, I believe, are more interested in the other aspect of him. It's N.H. that interests you." No challenge was intended, yet the glove was flung. Fillory said nothing for a minute or two. Then he looked up, and their eyes met across the smoke-laden atmosphere. It was close on midnight. The world lay very still and hushed about the house. "It is," he said quietly, "a pathetic and inspiring case. He is deserving of—" he chose his words slowly and with care. "Our very best," he concluded shortly. "And now," he added quickly, "you're tired out, and I ought to have let you have a night's sleep before taxing you like this." He poured out 2 glasses of whiskey. "Let us drink anyhow to success and healing of body, mind, and soul." "Body, mind, and nerves," said Debenham slowly, as he drank the toast. "The reason I had none of the trouble I anticipated," remarked Debenham as he sipped the reviving liquor, "is simple enough." "There are 2 periods, of course. I guessed that." "Exactly. There is the Levalloon period, when he is quiescent, normal, very charming into the bargain, more like a good child, or trained animal, or happy peasant, if you like it better, than a grown man. And there is the N.H. period, when he is otherwise." "Ah." "I arrived just at the transition moment, so to speak. It was during the change I reached the chalet." "Precisely." Fillory looked up, smiled, and nodded. "That's about the truth," repeated Debenham, putting his glass down. He thought for a moment, then added slowly, "I think that fire of his, the worship, singing, at the autumnal equinox, marked the change. N.H. at once after that slipped back into the unconscious state. Levalloon emerged. It was with Levalloon only, or chiefly, I had to deal. He became so very quiet, dazed a little, half there as we call it, and almost entirely silent. He retained little, if any, memory of the N.H. period, although it lies, I think, just beneath the surface only. The love alone personality, you see, is not very positive, is it? It seems a quiet, negative state, a condition almost of rest, in fact. Fillory listened attentively, made no rejoinder. "We may expect," continued Debenham, "these alternating states, I think. The frontier between them is, as I said, a narrow one. Indeed, often they merge or interpenetrate. In my judgment, the main, important part of his consciousness, that parent self, is love alone, not NH." The voice was slightly strident. "Ah." It so happened that, in the act of exchanging these last words, they both looked up toward the ceiling, where a moth buzzed round and round, banging itself occasionally against the electric light. Whether it was this that drew their sight upward simultaneously, or whether it was that some other sound in the stillness of the night had caught their strained attention, is uncertain. The same thought, at any rate, was in both minds at that instant, the same freight of meaning trailing behind it invisibly across the air. Their hearts burned within them. The two faces upward turned, the lips a little parted, as when listening is intense, the heads thrown back. For in the room above that ceiling, asleep at this moment, lay the subject of their long discussion. Only a few inches of lath and plaster separated them from the strange being who, dropping out of space, as it were, had come to make his home with them. A being, lonely utterly in the world, unique in kind perhaps, his nature as yet undecipherable, lay trustingly unconscious in that upper chamber. The two men felt the gravity, the responsibility of their charge. The same thought had vividly touched them both at the same instant. A few minutes later they were still standing, facing one another. They were of a height, but compared to Fillory's big frame and rugged head, his friend's appearance was almost slight. Debenham, for all his qualifications, looked painfully like a shop-walker. They exchanged this steady gaze for a few seconds without speaking. Then the older man said quietly, "Paul, I understand, and I respect your reticence. I think I can agree with it." He placed a hand upon the other's shoulder, smiling gently, even tenderly. "You have told me much, but you have not told me all. The chief part you have intentionally omitted." "For the present, at any rate," was the reply, given without flinching. "Your reasons are sound, your judgment perhaps right. I ask no questions. What happened, what you saw at the chalet, the peculiar powers you mentioned, all, in fact, that you think it wise to keep to yourself for the moment, I leave there willingly." He spoke gravely, sincere emotion in the eyes and tone. It was in a lower voice he added, "The responsibility, of course, is yours." Debenham returned the steady gaze, pondering his reply a moment. "I can and do accept it," he answered. "You have read my thoughts correctly, as usual, Edward. I think you know quite enough already, what with my notes and Mason's letter, even too much. Besides, why complicate it with an account of what were doubtless mere mental pictures, hallucinations on my part? This is a matter," he went on slowly, "a case we dare not trifle with. There may be strange and terrible afflictions in it later. We must remain unbiased." The anxiety deepened on his face. "True, true," murmured the other. "God bless the boy. May his own gods bless him." "In other words, it will need your clearest, soundest judgment, your finest skill, your very best, as you said yourself just now." He used a firmer, yet also a softer tone suddenly. "Edward, you know your own mind, its contents, its suppressions, its origin. Your refusal of the love of women, your deep, powerful dreams that you have suppressed and put away. Promise me," the voice and manner were very earnest, "that you will not communicate these to him in any way, and that you will keep your judgment absolutely unbiased and untainted." He looked at his old friend and paused. "Only your purest judgment of what is to come can help. You promise?" Fillory sighed a scarcely noticeable sigh. "I promise you, Paul. You are wise, and you are right," he said. "On the other hand, let me say one thing to you in my turn. This theory of heredity and of mental telepathic transference, the idea that all his mind's content is derived from his parents and from Mason, we cannot, remember, force this transference and interchange too far. I ask only this: be fair and open yourself with all that follows." Debenham raised his voice. "Nor can we, apparently, set limits to it, Edward. But, to be fair and open-minded, I give my promise too." Thus, in the little downstairs room of a private home for incurable mental cases, not a lunatic asylum, though sometimes perhaps next door to it, these two men, deeply intrigued by a new case that passed their understanding as it exceeded their knowledge, practice, and experience, swore to each other to observe carefully, to report faithfully, and to experiment, if experiment proved necessary, with honest and affectionate uprightness. Their views were, obviously, not the same. Debenham, temperamentally opposed to radical innovations, believed it was a case of divided personality. Hundreds of such cases had passed through their hands. Forced to accept extended telepathy, that all minds can, on occasion, share one another's content, and that even a racial and a world memory can be tapped, he feared that his chief might influence Levallois and twist thus the phenomena to a special end. He knew Edward Fillory's story. He feared, for the sake of truth, the mental transference. He had perhaps other fears as well. Fillory, on the other hand, believing as much and knowing more than his colleague, saw in N.H. a unique possibility. He was thrilled and startled with a half-impossible hope. He felt as if someone ran beside his life, bearing impossible glad tidings, an unexpected, half-incredible figure, the tidings marvelously bright. He hoped, he already wished to think, that N.H. might shadow forth a promise of some magical advance for the ultimate benefit of the race. The thinkers were crying on the housetops that progress was a myth, that each wave of civilization at its height reached the same average level without ever passing further. The menace to the present civilization, already crumbling, was in full swing everywhere. Knowledge, culture, learning threatened in due course with the chaos of destruction that has so far been the invariable rule. The one hope of saving the world, cried religion, lay in substituting spiritual for material values, a utopian dream at best. The one chance, said science, on the other hand, was that civilization today is continuous and not isolated. The best hope, believed Fillory, the only hope, lay in raising the individual by the drawing up into full consciousness of the limitless powers now hidden and inactive in his deeper self, the so-called subliminal faculties. With these greater powers must come also greater moral development. Already, with his uncanny insight, derived from knowledge of himself, he had piercingly divined in N.H. a being, whatever he might be, whose nature acted automatically and directly upon the subconscious self in everybody. That bright messenger, running past his life, had looked, as with fire and tempest, straight into his eyes. It was long after 1 o'clock when the two men said good night and went to their rooms. Debenham was soon in bed, though not soon asleep. Exhausted physically though he was, his mind burned actively. His recent memories were vivid. All he had purposely held back from Fillory returned with power. The uncertainty whether he had experienced hallucination, or had actually, as by telepathic transfer from La Vallone, touched another state of consciousness, kept sleep far away. His brain was far too charged for easy slumber. He feared for his dear, faithful friend, his colleague, the skillful, experienced, yet sorely tempted mind, tempted by nature and by natural weaknesses of birth and origin, who now shared with him the care and healing of a case that troubled his being too deeply for slumber to come quickly. Yet he had done well to keep these memories from Edward Fillory. If Fillory once knew what he knew, his judgment and his scientific diagnosis must be drawn hopelessly away from what he considered the best treatment, the suppression of NH and the making permanent of La Vallone. He fell asleep eventually towards dawn, dreaming impossible, radiant dreams of a world he might have hoped for, yet could not, within the limits of his little cautious, accurate mind, believe in. Dreams that inspire, yet sadden, haunted his release from normal consciousness. Someone had walked upon his life, leaving a growth of everlasting flowers in their magical tread, though his mind, his stolid, cautious mind, had no courage for the plucking. And while he slept, as the hours slipped from west to east, his chief and colleague, lying also sleepless, rose suddenly before the late autumn dawn and walked quietly along the corridor towards the private suite where the new patient rested. His mind was quiet, yet his inner mind alert. His thoughts, his hopes, his dreams, these lay perhaps beyond human computation. He was calmer far than his assistant, though more strangely tempted. It was just growing light. The corridor was cold. A cool, damp air came through the open windows, and the linoleum felt like ice against the feet. The house lay dead and silent. Pausing a moment by a window, he listened to the chattering of early sparrows. He felt chill and hungry, unrested too, though far from sleepy. He was aware of London, bleak, heavy, stolid London town. The troubles of modern life, of labor, politics, taxes, cost of living, all the common, daily things came in with the cheerless morning air. He reached the door he sought and very softly opened it. The radiance met him in the face, so that he almost gasped. The scent of flowers, the sting of sharp, keen forest winds, the exhilaration of some distant mountain top. There was actually a tang of dawn, known only to those who have tasted the heights at sunrise with the heart. And into his heart, singing with happy confidence, rose a sense of supreme joy and confidence that mastered all little earthly woes and pains and walked among the stars. The occupant of the bed lay very still. His shining hair was spread upon the pillow. The splendid limbs were motionless. The chest and arms were bare, the single covering sheet tossed off. The strange, wild face wore happiness and peace upon its skin, the features very calm, the mouth relaxed. It almost seemed a god lay sleeping there upon a little human bed. How long he stood and stared, he did not know. But suddenly the light increased. The curtains stirred about the bed. With a marvelous touch, the separate details merged and quickened into life. The room was changed. The occupant of the bed moved very swiftly, as through the open window came the first touch of exhilarating light. Gold stole across the lintel, breaking over the roofs of slates beyond. The leafless elm tree shimmered faintly. The telegraph wires shone. There was a running sparkle. It was dawn. The figure leapt, danced, no other word describes it, to the open window, where the light and air gushed in, spread wide its arms, lowered its radiant head, began to sing in low, melodious rhythmic chant. And Fillory, as silently as he had come, withdrew and closed the door unseen. His heart moved strangely, but his promise held him. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The Bright Messenger by Algernon Blackwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Bright Messenger, Chapter 7. The following days it seemed to both Fillory and Debenham that their discussion of the first night had been pitched in too intense, too serious a key. Their patient was so commonplace again, so ordinary. He made himself quite at home, seemed contented and uncurious, taking it for granted he had come to stay forever, apparently. Apart from his strange beauty, his size, virility, and a general impression he conveyed of immense energies he was too easygoing to make use of, he might have passed for a peasant, a countryman to whom city life was new, but an educated, or at least half-educated countryman. He was so big, yet never gauche. He was neither stupid nor ill-informed. The garden interested him. He knew much about the trees and flowers, birds and insects too. He discussed the weather, prevailing wind, moisture, prospects of change and so forth, with a judgment based on what seemed a natural, instinctive knowledge. The gardener looked on him with obvious respect. "Such nice manners, and such a steady eye," Mrs. Soames the matron mentioned, too, approvingly to Debenham. "But a lot in him he doesn't understand himself, unless I'm wrong. Not much the matter with his nerves, anyhow. Once he's married, unless I'm much mistaken, sir?" He was quiet, talking little, and spent the morning over the books Fillory had placed purposely in his sitting-room, books on simple physics, natural history, and astronomy. It was the latter that absorbed him most. He pored over them by the hour. Fillory explained the situation so far as he thought wise. The young man was honesty and simple innocence, but only vaguely interested in the life of the great city he now experienced for the first time. He had in his luggage a copy of the will by which Mason had left him everything, and he was pleased to know himself well provided for. Of Mason, however, he had only a dim, uncertain, almost an impersonal memory, as of someone encountered in a dream. "I suppose something's happened to me," he said to Fillory, his language normal and quite ordinary again. He spoke with a slight foreign accent. "There was somebody, of course, who looked after me and lived with me, but I can't remember who or where it was. I was very happy," he added, "and yet I miss something." Dr. Fillory, remembering his promise, did not press him. "It will all come back by degrees," he remarked in a sympathetic tone. "In the meantime, you must make yourself at home here with us, for as long as you like. You are quite free in every way. I want you to be happy here." "I live with you always," was the reply. "There are things I want to tell you, ask you too." He paused, looking thoughtful. "There was someone I told all to once." "Come to me with everything. I'll help you always, so far as I can." He placed a hand upon his knee. "There are feelings, big feelings I cannot reach quite, but that make me feel different." He smiled beautifully. "From others." Quick as lightning, he had changed the sentence at the last word, substituting others for you. Had he been aware of a slight uneasy emotion in his listener's heart? It had hardly betrayed itself by any visible sign, yet he had instantly divined its presence. Such evidences of a subtle, intimate understanding were not lacking. Yet Fillory admirably restrained himself. "There are bright places I have lost," he went on frankly, no sign of shy reserve in him. "I feel confused, lost somewhere, as if I didn't belong here. I feel," he used an odd word, "doubled." His face shaded a little.
"Big, overpowering London is bound to affect you," put in Fillory, who had noticed the rapid discernment. "After living among woods and mountains as you have lived for years, all will come right in a little time. We must settle down a bit first."
"Woods and mountains," repeated the other in a half-dreamy voice, his eyes betraying an effort to follow thought elsewhere. "Of course, yes, woods and mountains, and hot, living sunlight, and the winds." His companion shifted the conversation a little. He suggested a line of reading and study. They talked also of such ordinary but necessary things as providing a wardrobe, of food, exercise, companionship of his own age, and so forth. All the commonplace details of ordinary daily life, in fact. The exchange betrayed nothing of interest, nothing unusual. They mentioned theaters, music, painting, and beyond the natural curiosity of youth that was ignorant of these, no detail was revealed that need have attracted the attention of anybody, neither of doctor, psychologist, nor student of human nature. With the single exception that the past years had been obliterated from memory, though much that had been acquired in them remained, there was not noticeable peculiarity of any sort. Both language and point of view were normal. This was obviously Le Vallon. The NH personality scarcely cast a shadow even. Yet NH, the doctor was quick to see, lay ready and waiting just below the surface. There was no doubt in his mind which was the central self, and which its transient projection, the secondary personality. Again, as he sat and talked, he had the odd impression that someone with bright tidings ran swiftly past his life, perhaps towards it. The swift messenger was certainly not Le Vallon. Le Vallon, indeed, was but a shadow cast before this glad, bright visitant. Thus he felt, at any rate. Le Vallon was an empty simulacrum left behind, while NH rested, or was active upon other things, things natural to him elsewhere. Le Vallon was an arm, a limb, a feeler that NH thrust out. At Charing Cross, for instance, for a brief moment only, NH had peered across his shoulder, then withdrawn again. In the car had sat by his side Le Vallon. The being he now chatted with was also Le Vallon only. But in his own heart, deep down, hidden yet eager to break loose, lay his own deeper self that burned within him. This, the important part of him, yearned towards NH, and up rose the strange symbol that always appeared when his deepest, perhaps his subliminal self was stirred. That lost radiant valley in the haunted Caucasus shone close and brimming over, with light, with flowers, with splendid winds and fire, symbols of a vaster, grander, happier life, though perhaps a life not yet within the range of normal human consciousness. The fiery symbol flashed and passed. Curious thoughts and pictures rose flaming in his mind, persistent ideas that bore no possible relation to his intellectual, reasoning life. Passing across the background of his brain, as with waves of heat and color, they were correlated somewhere with harmonious sound. Music, that is, came with them, as though inspiration brought its own sound with it that made singing natural. They haunted him, these vague, pleasurable phantasmagoria that were connected, he felt sure, with music as with childhood's lost imaginings. For a long time he searched in vain for their source and origin. Then suddenly he remembered. He heard his father's gruff, humorous voice. "There's not a scrap of evidence, of course." And sharply, vividly, the buried memory gave up its dead. His childish question went crashing through the air. "Are we the only beings in the world?" Nothing is ever lost, he reminded himself with a smile that Debenham assuredly never saw. Every seed must bear its fruit in time. And emotion surged through him from the remorseless records of his underself. The childhood's love, with its correlative of deep, absolute belief, returned upon him, linked on somehow to that old familiar symbol he knew to mean his awakening subconscious being, a flowering Caucasian veil of sun and wind. A belief, he realized, especially a belief of childhood, remains forever inexpugnable, eternal, prolific seed of future harvests. The unstable in him betrayed its ineradicable, dangerous streak. There rose upon him, in a cloud, strange notions that inflamed imagination sweetly. Later reading, indeed, had laid flesh upon the skeleton of the boyish notion, though, derived in the first instance, he certainly knew not whence. The literature and tradition of the East, he recalled, peopled the elements with conscious life, to which the world's fairy tales, remnant of lost knowledge possibly, added nerves and heart and blood. In all human bodies, at any rate, dwelt not necessarily always human spirits, human souls. He checked himself with a smile he would have liked to call a chuckle, but that yet held some inexplicable happiness at its heart. His rugged, eager face, its expression bitten deeply by experience, turned curiously young. There rushed through him the Eastern conception of another system of life, another evolution, deathless, divine, important, the order of the Devas, a series of nature beings entirely apart from human categories. They included many degrees, from fairies to planetary spirits, the gods so-called. And their duties, work and purposes were concerned, he remembered, with carrying out the laws of nature, the busy tending of all forms and structures, from the elaborately marvelous infusoria in a drop of stagnant water, the growth of crystals, the upbuilding of flowers and trees, of insects, animals, humans, to the guidance and guardianship of those vaster forms of heavenly bodies, the stars, the planets, and the mighty suns, whose gigantic bodies, inhabited by immenser consciousness, people empty space. A noble, useful, selfless work, God's messengers. He checked himself again as the rich, ancient notion flitted across his stirring memory. Delightful, picturesque conceptions of the planet's young, fair ignorance, he reminded himself, smiling as before. Whereupon rose, bursting through his momentary dream with full-fledged power, the great hope of his own reasoned, scientific dream, that man is greater than he knows, and that the progress of the race was demonstrable. For to the subliminal powers of an awakened race these nature beings with their special faculties must lie open and accessible. The human and the non-human could unite. Nature must come back into the hearts of men and win them again to simple, natural life, with love, with joy, with naked beauty. Death and disease must vanish. Hope and purity return. The race must develop, grow, become in the true sense universal. It could know God. The vision flashed upon him with extraordinary conviction, so that he forgot for the moment how securely he belonged to the unstable. The smile of happiness spread, as it were, over his entire being. He glowed and pulsed with its delicious inward fire. Light filled his being for an instant of intoxicating belief and certainty and vision. The instant inspiration of a dream went lost and vanished. He had drawn upon childhood and legendary reading for the substance of a moment's happiness. He shook himself, so to speak. He remembered his patients and his duties, his colleague too. Nothing, meanwhile, occurred to arouse interest or attention. La Valonne was quite docile, ordinary. He needed no watching. He slept well, ate well, spent his leisure with his books and in the garden. He complained often of the lack of sunlight, and sometimes he might be seen taking some deep breaths of air into his lungs by the open window or on the balcony. The phases of the moon, too, interested him, and he asked once when the full moon would come, and then, when Debenham told him, he corrected the date the latter gave, proving him 2 hours wrong. But on the whole, there seemed little to differentiate him from the usual young man whose physique had developed in advance of his mental faculties. His knowledge in some respects certainly was backward, as in the case of arrested development. He seemed an intelligent countryman, but an unusually intelligent countryman, though all the time another underintelligence shone brightly, betraying itself in remarks and judgments oddly phrased. Dr. Fillory took him, during the following day or two, to concerts, theaters, cinemas. He enjoyed them all. Yet in the theaters he was inclined to let his attention wander. The degree of alertness varied oddly. His critical standard, moreover, was curiously exacting. He demanded the real creative interpretation of a part, and was quick to detect a lack of inspiration, of fine technique, of true conception in a player. Reasons he failed to give, and argument seemed impossible to him, but if voice or gesture or imaginative touch failed anywhere, he lost interest in the performer from that moment. "He has poor breath," he remarked. "He only imitates. He is outside." Or, "She pretends. She does not feel and know. Feeling, the feeling that comes of fire, she has not felt." "She does not understand her part, you mean?" suggested Fillory. "She does not burn with it," was the reply. At concerts he behaved individually, too. They bored as well as puzzled him. The music hardly stirred him. He showed signs of distress at anything classical, though Wagner, Debussy, the Russians moved him and produced excitement. "He," was his remark with emphasis, "has heard. He gives me freedom. I could fly and go away. He sets me free." And then he would say no more, not even in reply to questions. He could not define the freedom he referred to, nor could he say where he would go away to. But his face lit up. He smiled his delightful smile. He looked happy. "Stars," he added once in a tone of interest, in reply to repeated questions. "Stars, wind, fire, away from this." He tapped his head and breast. "I feel more alive and real." "It's real and true, that music? That's what you feel?" "It's beyond this," he replied, again tapping his body. "They have heard." The cinema interested him more, yet its limits seemed to perplex him more than its wonder thrilled him. He accepted it as a simple, natural, universal thing. "They stay always on the sheet," he observed with evident surprise, "and I hear nothing. They do not even sing. Sound and movement go together." "The speaking will come," explained Fillory. "Those are pictures merely." "I understand. Yet sound is natural, isn't it? They ought to be heard." "Speech," agreed his companion, "is natural, but singing isn't." "Are they not alive enough to sing?" was the reply, spoken to himself rather than to his neighbor, who was so attentive to his last response. "Do they only sing when—" Fillory heard it and felt something leap within him. "When they are paid, or have an audience?" He finished the sentence quickly. "No one sings naturally of their own accord. Not in cities, at any rate," was the reply. La Valonne laughed, as though he understood at once. "There is no sun and wind," he murmured. "Of course, they cannot." It was the cinemas that provided most material for observation, Fillory found. There was in a cinema performance something that excited his companion, but excited him more than the doctor felt he was justified in encouraging. Obviously, the other side of him, the NH aspect, came up to breathe under the stimulus of the rapid, world-embracing, space and time-destroying pictures on the screen. Concerts did not stimulate him, it seemed, but rather puzzled him. He remained wholly the commonplace Levalloon, with one exception. He drew involved patterns on the edge of his programs, patterns of a very complicated yet accurate kind, as though he almost saw the sounds that poured into his ears. And these ornamented programs Dr. Fillory preserved. Sound, music, seemed to belong to his interpretation of movement. About the cinema, however, there seemed something almost familiar, something he already knew and understood, the sound belonging to movement only lacking. Apart from these small incidents, Levalloon showed nothing unusual, nothing that a yokel untaught yet of natural intelligence might not have shown. His language, perhaps, was singular, but, having been educated by one mind only, and in a region of lonely forests and mountains, remote from civilized life, there was nothing inexplicable in the odd words he chose, nor in the peculiar, if subtle and penetrating, phrases that he used. Invariably, he recognized the spontaneous, creative power as distinguished from the derivative that merely imitated. He found ways of expressing himself almost immediately, both in speech and writing, however, and with a perfection far beyond the reach of a half-educated country lad. And this swift aptitude was puzzling until its explanation suddenly was laid bare. He absorbed, his companion realized at last, as by telepathy, the content of his own, of Fillory's mind, acquiring the latter's mood, language, ideas, as though the two formed one being. The discovery startled the doctor. Yet what startled him still more was the further discovery, made a little later, that he himself could, on occasions, become so identified with his patient that the slightest shade of thought or feeling rose spontaneously in his own mind too. He remained otherwise almost entirely Levalloon, and, after a full report made to Debenham and the detailed discussion thereon that followed, Dr. Fillory had no evidence to contradict the latter's opinion. Levalloon is the real true self. The other personality, NH as we call it, is a mere digest and accumulation of material supplied by his parents and by Mason. Let us wait and see what happens when NH appears and does something, Fillory was content to reply. If, answered Debenham, with skeptical emphasis, it ever does appear. You think it won't? Asked Fillory. With proper treatment, said Debenham decisively, I see no reason why NH should not become happily merged in the parent self, in Levalloon, and a permanent cure result. He put his glasses straight and stared at his chief, as much as to say, "You promised." "Perhaps," said Fillory. "But, in my judgment, Levalloon is too slight to count at all. I believe the whole real parent self is NH, and the only life Levalloon has at all is that which peeps up through him, from NH." Fillory returned his serious look. "If NH is the real self, and I am right," he added slowly, "you, Paul, will have to revise your whole position." "I shall," returned Debenham. "But, you will allow this, it is a lot to expect. I see no reason to believe in anything more than a subconscious mind of unusual content, and possibly of unusual powers and extent," he added with reluctance. "It is," said Fillory significantly, "a lot to expect, as you said just now. I grant you that. Yet I feel it possible that—" He hesitated. Debenham looked uncomfortable. He fidgeted. He did not like the pause. A sense of exasperation rose in him, as though he knew something of what was coming. "Paul," went on his chief abruptly in a tone that dropped instinctively to a lower key, almost a touch of awe lay behind it. "You admit no deity, I know, but you admit purpose, design, intelligence." "Well," replied the other patiently, long experience having taught him iron restraint, "it's a blundering, imperfect system, inadequately organized, if you care to call that intelligence. It's of an extremely intricate complexity. I admit that. Deity I consider an unnecessary assumption." "The love and hate of atoms alone bowls you over," was the unexpected comment. "The word laws explains nothing. A machine obeys the laws, but intelligence conceived that machine, and a man repairs and keeps it going. What keeps the daisy going, the crystal, the creative thought in the imagination? An egg becomes a leaf-eating caterpillar, which in turn becomes a honey-eating butterfly with wings. A yolk turns into feathers. Is that accomplished without intelligence?" "Ask our new patient," interrupted Debenham, wiping his glasses with unnecessary thoroughness. "Which?" Debenham, startled, looked up without his glasses. It seemed the question made him uneasy. Putting the glasses on suddenly, he stared at his chief. "I see what you mean, Edward," he said earnestly, his interest deeply captured. "Be careful. We know nothing, remember, nothing of life. Don't jump ahead like this or take your dreams for reality. We have our duty in a case like this." Fillory smiled, as though to convey that he remembered his promise. "Humanity," he replied, "is a very small section of the universe. Compared to the minuter forms of life, which may be quite as important, if not more so, the human section is even negligible. While compared to the possibility of greater forms—" He broke off abruptly. "As you say, Paul, we know nothing of life after all, do we? Nothing less than nothing. We observe and classify a few results, that's all. We must beware of narrow prejudice, at any rate, you and I." His eyes lost their light, his speech dried up, his ideas, dreams, speculations returned to him unrewarded, unexpressed. With natures in whom the subconscious never stirred, natures through whom its magical fires cast no faintest upward gleam, intercourse was ever sterile, unproductive. Such natures had no background. Even a fact, with them, was detached from its true big life, its full significance, its divine potentialities. "We must beware of prejudice," he repeated quietly. "We seek truth only." "We must beware," replied Debenham as he shrugged his shoulders, "of suggestion, of auto-suggestion above all. We must remember how repressed desires dramatize themselves, especially," he added significantly, "when aided by imagination. We seek only facts." On his face appeared swiftly, before it vanished again, an expression of keen anxiety, almost of affliction, yet tempered, as it were, by surprise and wonder, by pity possibly, and certainly by affection. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The Bright Messenger by Algernon Blackwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Bright Messenger. Chapter 8. To Debenham, meanwhile, Le Vallon's behavior was polite and kind and distant. He did not show distrust of any sort, but he betrayed a certain diffidence, reserve, and caution. Trust he felt, sympathy he did not feel. To the amusement of Fillory, he suggested almost a kind of mild contempt when dealing with him, and this amusement was increased by the fact that it obviously annoyed Debenham, while it gratified his chief. For towards Fillory, Lev alone behaved with an intimate and understanding sympathy that proved his instantaneous affection based upon mutual comprehension. It seemed that Lev alone and Fillory had known one another always. It was doubtless due to this innate sympathy between them that Edward Fillory's rare gift of absorbing the content of another's mind, even to the point of taking on that other's conditions, physical and emotional at the same time, was so successful. By means of a highly developed power of autosuggestion, he had learned so to identify his own mind, thought, feeling with those of a patient, that there resulted a kind of merging by which he literally became that patient. He felt with him. As a subject sees the pictures in the hypnotizer's mind, perceives his thoughts, divines his slightest will, so Fillory, reversing the process, could realize for the moment exactly what his patient was thinking, feeling, desiring. It was of great use to him in his strange practice. This gift, naturally, varied in degree, and was not invariably successful. In some cases he only felt, the emotion alone being thus transferred. In others he only saw what the patient saw, or thought he saw, the accompanying emotion being omitted. In others again, as in cases of vision at a distance, either of time or space, he had been able to follow the traveling sight of his patient, whose consciousness in trance was operating far away, and thus to check for subsequent verification exactly what that patient saw. He had shared strange experiences with others, with a man, for instance, in whom sight was transferred to the tip of his index finger, so that he could read a book by passing that finger along the printed line. With a woman, again, in whom exteriorized consciousness manifested itself, so that if the air several inches from her face was pinched or struck, the impact was received, and an actual bruise produced upon her skin. This extension of consciousness, its seeds already in his nature, he had trained and developed to a point where he could almost rely upon autosuggestion bringing about quickly the desired conditions. Its success, however, as mentioned, was variable. With N.H., especially now, this variableness was marked. Sometimes it was so easily accomplished as to seem natural and without a conscious effort, while at other times it failed completely. Since it was in no sense an attempt to transfer anything from his own mind to that of the patient, Fillory felt that his promise to his colleague was not involved. The following scene describes the first time in which the process took place with his new patient. Fillory himself wrote down the words, supplied the detailed description, filled in the emotion and psychology, but exactly as these occurred and as he felt them, both when these took place, respectively, in his own consciousness and in that of his patient. Part of the time he was present, part of it he was not visibly so, being screened from observation, yet so placed that he could note everything that happened. It is clear, however, that his mind was so intimately en rapport with the thoughts and feelings of N.H. that he experienced in his own being all that N.H. experienced. The description was written immediately after the occurrence, though some of it, the spoken language in particular, was jotted down in his hiding-place at the actual moment. The interlacing of the two minds, their interpenetration, as it were, one occasionally dominating the other, is curious to trace and far from difficult to disentangle. Similarly, the interweaving of Lev alone and N.H. is noticeable. The description given by Debenham of the portion of the occurrence he witnessed personally, or heard about from Nurse Robbins and the attendants, this description reduces the whole thing to the commonplace level of a slight seizure accompanied by signs of violence and moments of delirium due to excitement and fatigue, and soon cured by sleep. The occurrence took place precisely at the period when the moon was at the full. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of The Bright Messenger by Algernon Blackwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Bright Messenger. Chapter 9. The body I'm in and using is 22, as they call it, and from a man named Mason, a geologist, I receive sums of money, regularly paid, with which I live. They call it live. A roof and walls protect me, who do not need protection. My body, which it irks, is covered with wool and cloth and stuff, fitting me as bark fits a tree, and yet not part of me. My feet, which love the touch of earth and yearn for it, are cased in dead dried skin called leather. Even my head and hair, which crave the sun and wind, are covered with another piece of dead dried skin, shaped like a shell, but an ugly shell, in which, were it shaped otherwise, the wind and rustling leaves might sing with flowers. Before 22 I remember nothing definite, that is. I opened my eyes in a soft but not refreshing case, standing on 4 iron legs, and well off the ground, and covered with coarse white coverings piled thickly on my body. It was a bed. Slabs of transparent stuff kept out the living sunshine for which I hungered. Thick, solid walls shut off the wind. No stars or moon showed overhead, because an enormous lid hid every bit of sky. No dew, therefore, lay upon the sheets. I smelt no earth, nor leaves, nor flowers. No single natural sound entered, except the chattering of dirty sparrows, which had lost its freshness. I was in a hospital. One comely figure alone gave me a little joy. It was soft and slim and graceful, with a smell of fern and morning in its hair, though that hair was lustreless and balled up in ugly lumps, with strips of thin metal in it. They called it nurse and sister. It was the first moving thing I saw when my eyes opened on my limited and enclosed surroundings. My heart beat quicker. A flash of thin joy came up in me. I had seen something similar before somewhere. It reminded me, of something I had known elsewhere, though but a shabby, lifeless, clumsy copy of this other glorious thing. Though not real, it stirred this faint memory of reality, so that I caught at the skirts of moonlight, stars and flowers, reflected in a forest pool where my companion played for long periods of happiness between our work. The perfume and the eyes did that. I watched it for a bit as it moved away, came close and looked at me. When the eyes met mine, a wave of life, but of little life, surged faintly through me. They were dim and pitiful, these eyes, mournful, unlit, unseeing. The stars had set in them. Dull shadows crowded. They were so small. They were hungry, too. They were unsatisfied. For some minutes it puzzled me. Then I understood. That was the word, unsatisfied. Ah, but I could alter that. I could comfort, help at any rate. My strength, though horribly clipped and blocked, could manage a little thing like that. My smaller rhythms I could put into it. The eyes, the smile, the whole soft, comely bundle, so pitifully hungry and unsatisfied, I rose and seized, pressing it close inside my own great arms, and bearing it all against my breast. I crushed it, but very gently, as I might crush a sapling. My lips were amid the ferny hair. I breathed upon it willingly, glad to help. It was a poor, unfinished thing, I felt at once, soft and yielding where it should have been resilient and elastic as fresh turf. The perfume had no body. It faded instantly. There was so little life in it. But as I held it in my big embrace, smothering its hunger as best I could within my wave of being, this bundle, this poor pitiful bundle, screamed and struggled to get free. It bit and scratched and uttered sounds like those squeaks the less swift creatures make when the swifter overtake them. I was too surprised to keep it to me. I relaxed my hold. The instant I did so, the figure, thus released, stood upright, like a young birch the wind sets free. The figure looked alive. The hair fell loose, untidily. The puny face wore color. The eyes had fire in them. I saw that fire. It was a message. Memory stirred faintly in me. "Ah," I cried, "I've helped you anyhow a little." The scene that followed filled me with such trouble and bewilderment that I cannot recall exactly what occurred. The figure seemed to spit at me, yet not with grace and invitation. There was no sign of gratitude. I was entirely misunderstood, it seemed. Bells rang as the figure rushed to the door and flung it open. It called aloud. Similar, though quite lifeless figures came in answer and filled the room. A doctor, Devenham they called him, followed them. I was most carefully examined in a dozen curious ways that tickled my skin a little so that I smiled. But I lay quite still and silent, watching the whole performance with a confusion in my being that baffled my comprehending what was going on. Most of the figures were frightened. Then the doctor gave place to Filari, whose name was Rhythm. To him I spoke at once. "I wish to comfort and revive her," I told him. "She is so starved. I was most gentle. She brings a message only." He made no reply, but gazed at me with the corners of his mouth both twitching, and in his eyes, his eyes had more of the sun in them, a flash of something that had known fire at least, if it had not kept it. "My God, I worship thee," I murmured at the glimpse of the power I must own as master and creator of my being. "Even when thou art playful, I adore thee and obey." Then 4 other figures, shaped like the doctor, but wholly mechanical, a mere blind weight operating through them, held my arms and legs. Not the least desire to move was in me, luckily. I say luckily because, had I wished it, I could have flung them through the roof, blown down the little walls, caught up a dozen figures in my arms, and rushed forth with them towards the powers of fire and wind to which I belonged. Could I? I felt that I could. The sight of the true fire, small though it was, in the comely figures and the doctor's eyes, had set me in touch again with my home and origin. This touch I had somehow lost. I had been ill with what they called nervous disorder and injured reason. The lost touch was now restored, but luckily, as I said, there was no desire in me to set free these other figures, to help them in any way, after the reception my first kindly effort had experienced. I lay quite still, held by these 4 grotesque and puny mechanisms. The comely one, with the other similar to her, had withdrawn. I felt very kindly towards them all, but especially towards the doctor, Filari, who had shown that he knew my deity and origin. None of them were worth much trouble anyhow. I felt that too. A mild, sweet-toned contempt was in me. Dangerous was a word I caught them whispering as they went. I laughed a little. The 4 faces over me made odd grimaces, tightening their lips and gripping my legs and arms with greater effort. The doctor, Filari, noticed it. "Easy, remember," he addressed the 4. "There's really no need to hold. It won't recur." I nodded. We understood one another. And with a smile at me, he left the room, saying he would come back after a short interval. A link with my source, a brother as it were, went with him. I was lonely. I began to hum songs to myself. little fragments of a great natural music I had once known but lost, and I noticed that the 4 figures, as I sang, relaxed their grip of my limbs considerably. To tell the truth, I forgot that they were holding me. Their grip, anyhow, was but a thread I could snap without the smallest effort. The songs were happiness in me. Upon free-leaping rhythms I careered with an exhilarating rush of liberty. All about space I soared and sank. I was picked up, flung far, riding the crest of immense waves of orderly vibration that delighted me. I let myself go a bit, let my voice out, I mean. No effort accompanied my singing. It was automatic, like breathing almost. It was natural to me. These rhythmical sounds and the patterns that they wove in space were the outlines of forms it was my work to build. This expressed my nature. Only my power was blocked and stifled in this confining body. The fire and air which were my tools I could not control. I have forgotten.
"Got a voice, ain't he?" observed one of the figures admiringly. "Loonies can do most anything they have a mind to." "Grand opera, isn't it?" "Yes," mentioned the 4th. "But he'll lift the roof off presently. We'd better stop him before there's any trouble." I stopped of myself, however. Their remarks interested me. Also, while I had been singing, although I called it humming only, they had gradually let go of me, and were now sitting down on my bed and staring with quite pleasant faces. All their dim 8 eyes were fixed on me. Their forms were not built well. "Where did you get that from, Governor?" asked the one who had spoken first. "Can you give me the name of it?" The sound of his own voice was like the scratching of a pin after the enormous rhythm that now ceased. "Ain't printed, is it?" he went on, as I stared, not understanding what he meant. "I've got a sister at the Halls," he explained. "They'd make a hit with that kind of thing. Gave me quite a twist inside to hear it," he added, turning to the others. The others agreed solemnly with dull, stupid faces. I lay and listened to their talk. I longed to help them. I had forgotten how. "A bit churchy, I thought it," said one. "But I confess, it stirred me up." "Churchy or not, it's the stuff," insisted the first. "Oh, it's the stuff to give 'em right enough." And they looked at me admiringly again. "Where did you get it, if I may ask?" replied number 1 in a more respectful tone. His face looked quite polite. The lips stretched, showing yellow teeth. It was his smile. But his eyes were a little more real. Oh, where was my fire? I could have built the outline better so that he was real and might express far more. I have forgotten. "I hear it," I told him, "because I'm in it. It's all about me. It never stops. It's what we build with." Number 1 seemed greatly interested. "Hear it, do you? Why, that's odd now. You see—" He looked at his companions apologetically, as though he knew they would not believe him. "My father was like that. He heard his music, he always used to say, but we laughed at him. He was a composer by trade. Oh, his stuff was printed, too. Of course," he added, "there's musical talent in the family," as though that explained everything. He turned to me again. "Give us a little more, mister, if you don't object, that is," he added, and his face was soft as he said it. "Only gentle-like, if you don't mind." "Yes, keep it down a bit," another put in, looking anxiously in the direction of the closed door. He patted the air with his open palm, slowly, carefully, as though he patted an animal that might rise and fly at him. I hummed again for them, but this time with my lips closed.
The waves of rhythm caught me up and away. I soared and flew and dropped and rose again upon their huge colored crests. Curtains and sheets of quiet flame in palest gold flared shimmering through the sound, while winds that were full of hurricanes and cyclones swept down to lift the fire and dance with it in spirals. The perfume of great flowers rose. There were flowers everywhere, and stars shone through it all like showers of gold. Ah, I began to remember something. It was flowers and stars, as well as human forms, we worked to build. But I kept the fire from leaping into actual flame. The mighty winds I held back. Even thus pent and checked, their powerful volume made the atmosphere shake and pulse about us. Only I could not control them now. With an effort I came down as it were, and saw the funny little faces staring at me with opened eyes and mouths, and yellow teeth, pale gums, their skins gone whitish, their figures rigid with their tense emotion. They were so poorly made, the pattern so imperfect. The new respect in their manner was marked plainly. Suddenly, all four turned together towards the door. I stopped. The doctor had returned. But it was Filary again. I liked the feel of him. "He wanted to sing, sir, so we let him. It seemed to relieve him a bit," they explained quickly and with an air of helpless apology. "Good, good," said the doctor. "Quite good. Any normal expression that brings relief is good." He dismissed them. They went out, casting back at me expressions of puzzled thanks and interest. The door closed behind them. The doctor seated himself beside me and took my hand. I liked his touch. His hand was alive, at any rate, although within my own it felt rather like a dying branch or bunch of leaves I grasped. The life, if thin, was real. "Where's the rest of it?" I asked him, meaning the music. "I used to have it all. It's left me, gone away. What's cut it off?" "You're not cut off, really," he said gently. "You can always get into it again when you really need it." He gazed at me steadily for a minute, then said in his quiet voice, a full, nice tone with wind through a forest running in it, "Mason, Dr. Mason." He said no more, but watched me. The name stirred something in me I could not get at quite. I could not reach down to it. I was troubled by a memory I could not seize. "Mason," I repeated, returning his strong gaze. Who was Mason? And where? I connected the name with a sense of liberty, also with great winds and pools of fire, with great figures of golden skin and radiant faces, with music too, the music that had left me. "You've forgotten for the moment," came the deep running voice I liked. "He looked after you for 20 years. He gave his life for you. He loved you. He loved your mother. Your father was his friend." "Has he gone back?" "He's dead." "I can get after him, though," I said, for the name touched me with a sense of lost companionship I wanted, though the reference to my father and mother left me cold. "I can easily catch him up. When I move with my mind and fire, the fastest thing stands still." My own speed, once I was free again, I knew outpaced easily the swiftest bird, outpaced light itself. "Yes," agreed the doctor. "Only he doesn't want that now. You can always catch him up when the time comes. Besides, he's waiting for you anyhow." I knew that was true. I sank back, comforted upon the stuffy pillows, and lay silent. This tinkling chatter wearied me. It was like trickling wind. I wanted the flood of hurricanes, the pulse of storms. My building, shaping powers, my great companions, oh, where were they?
He taught you himself, taught you all you know.
I heard the tinkling go on again.
But he kept you away from life, thinking it was best. He was afraid for you, afraid for others too. He kept you in the woods and mountains, where, as he believed, you could alone express yourself and so be happy. 100 times, in babyhood and early childhood, you nearly died. He nursed you back to life. His own life he renounced. Now he is dead. He has left you all his money.
He paused. I said no word. Faint memories passed through my mind, but nothing I could hold and seize. The money I did not understand at all, except that it was necessary.
He thought at first that you could not possibly live to manhood. To his surprise, you survived everything: illness, accident, disaster of every sort and kind. Then, as you grew up, he realized his mistake. Instead of keeping you away from life, he ought to have introduced you to it and explained it, as I and Debenham are now trying to do. You could not live forever alone in woods and mountains. When he was gone, there would be no one to look after you and guide you.
The trickling of wind went on and on. I hardly listened to it. He did it for his own pleasure, I suppose. It pleased and soothed him possibly. Yet I remembered every syllable. It was a small detail to keep fresh when my real memory covered the whole planet.
Before he died, he recognized his mistake and faced the position boldly. It was some years before the end. He was hale and hearty still, yet the end he knew was in sight. While the power was still strong in him, therefore, he did the only thing left to him to do. He used his great powers. He used suggestion. He hypnotized you, telling you to forget, from the moment of his death, but not before, forget everything. It was only partially successful.
The door opened. The comely figure glanced in, then vanished. "She wants more help from me." I interrupted the monotonous tinkling instantly, for pity stirred in me again as I saw her eager, hungry, and unsatisfied little eyes. "Call her back. I feel quite willing. It is one of the lower forms we made. I can improve it." Dr. Fillory, as he was called, looked at me steadily, his mouth twitching at the corners as before, a flash of fire flitting through his eyes. The fire made me like and trust him. The twitching, too, I liked, for it meant he knew how absurd he was. Yet he was bigger than the other figures.
"You can't do that," he said. "You mustn't."
And then laughed outright.
"It isn't done, you know, here."
"Why not, sir?" I asked, using the terms the figures used. "I feel like that."
"Of course you do. But all you feel can't be expressed except at the proper times and places. The consent of the other party always is involved," he went on slowly, "when it's a question of expressing anything you feel."
This puzzled me, because in this particular instance the other party had asked me with her eyes to comfort her. I told him this. He laughed still more. Caught by the sound, it was just like wind passing among tall grasses on a mountain ridge. I forgot what he was talking about for the moment. The sound carried me away towards my own rhythms.
"You've got such amazing insight," he went on, tinkling to himself, for I heard, although I did not listen. "You read the heart too easily, too quickly. You must learn to hide your knowledge."
The laughter which ran with the words then ended, and I came back to the last thing I had definitely listened to. Expressing was the phrase he used. You told me that self-expression is the purpose for which I'm here." "I believe it is," he agreed, more solemnly. "Only sometimes, then?" "Exactly. If that expression involves another in pain or trouble or discomfort." "Ah, I have to choose, you mean. I have to know first what the other feels about it." I began to understand better. It was a game, and all games delighted me. "You may put it roughly so, yes," he explained. "You're very quick. I'll give you a rule to guide you," he went on. I listened with an effort. This tinkling soon wearied me. I could not think long or much. My way, it seemed, was feeling. "Ask yourself always how what you do will affect another," Dr. Fillory concluded. "That's a safe rule for you." "That is of children," I observed. We stared at each other a moment. "Both sides keep it?" I asked. "Childish," he agreed. "It certainly is. Both sides, yes, keep it." I sighed, and the sigh seemed to rise from my very feet, passing through my whole being. He looked at me most kindly then, asking why I sighed. "I used to be free," I told him. "This is not liberty. And why are we not all free together?" "It is liberty for two instead of only for one," he said, "and so on, in the long run, liberty for all." "So that's where they are," I remarked, but to myself and not to him. "Not further than that." For what I had once known, but now it seemed forgotten, was far beyond such a foolish little game. We had lived without such tiny tricks. We lived openly and unafraid. We worked in harmony. We lived. Yes, but who was we? That was the part I had forgotten. "It is the growth and development of civilization." I heard the little drift of wind go whistling thinly. "And it won't take you long to become quite civilized at this rate. More civilized, indeed, than most, with your swift intelligence and lightning insight." "Civilization," I repeated to myself. Then I looked at his eyes, which hid carefully in their depths somewhere that tiny cherished flame I loved. "Your ways are really very simple," I said. "It's all easy enough to learn. It is so small." "A man studying ants," he tinkled, "finds them small, but far from simple. You may find complications later. If so, come to me." I promised him, and the fire gleamed faintly in his eyes a moment. "He entrusted you to me. Your mother," he added softly, "was the woman he loved." "Civilization," I repeated, for the word set going an odd new rhythm in me that I rather liked, and that tired me less than the other things he said. "What is it, then? You are a race, you told me." "A race of human beings, of men and women developing. The comely ones are the women. Together we make up the race." "And civilization?" "Is realizing that we are a community, learning, growing, all its members living for the others as well as for themselves." Dr. Fillory told me then about men and women and sex, how children are made, and what enormous and endless work was necessary merely to keep them all alive and clothed and sheltered before they could accomplish anything else of any sort at all. Half the labor of the majority was simply to keep alive at all. It was an ugly little system he described. Much I did not hear, because my thinking powers gave out. Some of it gave me an awful feeling he called pain. The confusion and imperfection seemed beyond repair, even beyond the worth of being part of it, of being to it at all. Moreover, the making of children, without which the whole thing must end, gave me spasms of irritation he called laughter. Only the comely ones, and what he told me of them, made me want to sing. "The men," I said, "but do they see that it is ugly and ludicrous and—" Comic, he helped me. Do they know, I asked, taking his unknown words, that it's comic? The glamour, he said, conceals it from them. To the best among them, it is sacred even. And the comely ones? It is their chief mission, he replied. Always remember that. It's sacred. He fixed his kind eyes gravely on my face. Ah, worship, you mean, I said. I understand. Again we stared for some minutes. Yet all are not comely, are they? I asked presently. The fire again shone faintly in his eyes as he watched me a moment without answering. It caught me away. I am not sure if I heard his words, but I think they ran like this. That's the point where civilization, so far, has always stopped. I remember he ceased tinkling then. Our talk ceased too. I was exhausted. He told me to remember what he had said and to lie down and rest. He rang the bell, and a man, one of the 4 who had held me, came in. "Ask Nurse Robbins to come here a moment, please," he said. And a moment later the comely one entered softly and stood beside my bed. She did not look at me. Dr. Fillory began again his little tinkling. "Wishes to apologize to you most sincerely, nurse, for his mistake. He meant no harm, believe me. There is no danger in him, nor will he ever repeat it. His ignorance of our ways, I must ask you to believe—" "Oh, it's nothing, sir," she interrupted. "I've quite forgotten it already, and usually he's as good as gold and perfectly quiet." She blushed, glancing shyly at me with clear invitation. "It will not recur," repeated the doctor positively. "He has promised me. He is very, very sorry and ashamed." The nurse looked more boldly a moment. I saw her silver teeth. I saw the hint of soft fire in her poor, pitiful eyes, but far, far away, and as she thought, safely hidden. "Pitiful one, I will not touch you," I said instantly. "I know that you are sacred." I noticed at once that her sweet natural perfume increased about her as I said the words, but her eyes were lowered, though she smiled a little, and her little cheeks grew colored. I saw her small teeth of silvery marble again. Our work was visible. I liked it. "You have promised me," said Dr. Fillory, rising to go out. "I promise," I said, while the comely one was arranging my pillows and sheets with quick, clever hands, sometimes touching my cheek on purpose as she did so. "I will not worship unless it is commanded of me first. The increased sweetness of her smell will tell me." But indeed already I had forgotten her, and I no longer realized who it was that tripped about my bed, doing numerous little things to make me comfortable. My friend, the understanding one, companion of my big friend Mason, who was dead, also had left the room. His twitching mouth, his laughter, his shining eyes were gone. I was aware that the comely one remained, doing all manner of little things about me and my bed, unnecessary things, but my pity and my worship were not asked, so I forgot her. My thinking had wearied me, and my feeling was not touched. I began to hum softly to myself. My giant rhythms rose. I went forth towards my powers of wind and fire, full of my own natural joy. I forgot the race with its men, its women, its rules and games, its tiny tricks, its civilization. I was free for a little with my own. One detail interfered a little with the rhythms, but only for a second, and very faintly even then. The comely one's face grew dark. "He's gone off asleep, actually," I heard her mutter as she left the room with a fling of her little skirts, shutting the door behind her with a bang. That bang was far away. I was already rising and falling in that natural happy state which to me meant freedom. It is hard to tell about, but that dear Filary knows, I am sure, exactly what I know, though he has forgotten it. He has known us somewhere, I feel. He understands our service. But, like me, he has forgotten too. What really happened to me? Where did I go? What did I see and feel when my rhythms took me off? Thinking is nowhere in it. I can tell him that. I am conscious of the sun. One difficulty is that my being here confuses me. Here I am already caught, confined, and straightened. I am within certain limits. I can only move in 3 ways, 3 measurements, 3 dimensions. The space I am in here allows only little rhythms. They are coarse and slow and heavy, and beat against confining walls, as it were, are thrown back, cross and recross each other, so that, while they themselves grow less, their confusion grows greater. The forms and outlines I can build with them are poor and clumsy and insignificant. Spirals I cannot make. Then I forget. Into these small rhythms I cannot compress myself. The squeezing hurts, yet neither can I make them bigger to suit myself. I would break forth towards the sun. Thus I feel cramped, confused, and crippled. It is almost impossible to tell of my big rhythms, for it is an attempt to tell of one thing in terms of another. How can I fix fire and wind upon the point of a pin, for instance, and examine them through a magnifying glass? The sun remains. What I experience, really, when I go off into my own freedom, is release. My rhythms are of the sun. They are his messengers. They are my law. They are my life and happiness. By means of them I fulfill the purpose of my being. I work, so Filary calls it. I build. That, at any rate, is literally true. My thinking stops at that point, perhaps, but I mean by release, that I escape back from being trapped by all these separate little individualities, human beings each working on his own, for his own, and against all the others. Escape from this stifling tangle into the sweep of my big rhythms, which work together and in unison. I search for lost companions, but do not find them. The golden skins and radiant faces, the mighty figures and the splendid shapes. They work without effort, however. That is another difference. I too work, only I work with them, and never against them. I can draw upon them as they can draw upon me. We do draw on one another. We know harmony. Service is our method and system. My dear Filary also wants to know who we are. How can I tell him? The moment I try to think, I seem to forget. This forgetting, indeed, is one of the limits against which I bang myself, so that I am flung back upon the tangle of criss-cross, tiny rhythms, which confuse and obliterate the very thing he wants to know. Yet the sun I never forget, father of fire and wind. My companions are lost temporarily. I am shut off from them. It seems I cannot have them and the race at the same time. I yearn and suffer to rejoin them. The service we all know together is great joy. Of love, this love between 2 isolated individuals, the race counts the best thing they have. We know nothing. Now, here is one thing I can understand quite clearly. I have watched and helped the race, as he calls it, for countless ages. Yet from outside it, never till now have I been inside its limits with it. And a dim sense of having watched it through a veil or curtain comes to me. I can faintly recall that I tried to urge my big rhythms in among its members. Its great waves of heat or sound might be launched upon an ant-heap. I used to try to force and project my vast rhythms into their tiny ones, hoping to make these latter swell and rise and grow, but never with success. Though a few members, here and there, felt them and struggled to obey and use their splendid swing. The rest did not seem to notice them at all. Indeed, they object to the struggling efforts of the few who did feel them, for their own small, accustomed rhythms were interfered with. The few were generally broken into little pieces and pushed violently out of the way. And this made me feel pitiful, I remember dimly, because the smaller rhythms, though insignificant, were exquisite. They were of extraordinary beauty. Could they only have been increased, the race that knew and used them must have changed my own, which, though huge and splendid of their kind, lacked the intense, perfect loveliness of the smaller kind. The race, had it accepted mine and mastered them, must have carried themselves and me towards still mightier rhythms which I alone could never reach. This, then, is clear to me, though very faint now. Fillory, who can think for a long time, instead of like me for seconds only, will understand what I mean. For if I tell him what we did, he may be able to think out what we were. Your work? He asked me too. I'm not sure I know what he means by work. We were incessantly active, but not for ourselves. There was no effort. There was easy and sure accomplishment, in the sense that nothing could stop or hinder our fulfilling our own natures. Obstacles, indeed, helped our power and made it greater, for everything feeds fire and opposite adds to the pressure of wind. Our main activity was to make perfect forms. We were form builders. Apart from this, our work was to maintain and keep active all rhythms less than our own, yet of our kind. I speak of my own kind alone. We had no desire to be known outside our kind. We worked and moved and built up swiftly, but out of sight, an endless service. You are the powers behind what we call nature, then? The dear Fillory asked me. You operate behind growing things, even behind inanimate things like trees and stones and flowers. Your big rhythms, as you call them, are our laws of nature. Your own particular department, your own elements evidently, were heat and air. I could not answer that, but as he said it, I saw in his grey eyes the flash of fire which so few of his race possessed, and I felt vaguely that he was one of the struggling members who was aware of the big rhythms, and who would be put away in little pieces later by the rest. It made me pitiful. Forget your own tiny rhythms, I said, and come over to us. But bring your tiny rhythms with you, because they are so exquisitely lovely. We shall increase them. He did not answer me. His mouth twitched at the corners, and he had an attack of that irritation, which, he says, is relieved and expressed by laughter. Yet the face shone. The laughter, however, was a very quick, full, natural answer all the same. It was happy and enthusiastic. I saw that laughter made his rhythms bigger at once. Then laughter was probably the means to use. It was a sort of bridge. Your instantaneous comprehension of our things puzzles me, he said. You grasp our affairs and all their relations so swiftly, yet it is all new to you. His voice and face made me wish to stroke and help him. He was so dear and eager. How do you manage it? He asked point-blank. Our things are surely foreign to your nature. But they are of children, I told him. They are small and so very simple. There are no difficulties. Your language is block letters because your self-expression, as you call it, is so limited. It all comes to me at a glance. I and my kind can remember a million tiniest details without effort. He did not laugh, but his face looked full of questions. I could not help him further. A scrap, probably, of what you've taught us, I heard him mumble, though no further questions came. Well, he went on presently, while I lay and watched the pale fire slip in tiny waves about his eyes. "Remember this. Since our alphabet is so easy to you, follow it, stick to it, do not go outside it. There's a good rule that will save trouble for others as well as for yourself." "I remember, and I try. But it is not always easy. I get so cramped and stiff and lifeless with it." "This sunless, chilly England, of course, cannot feed you," he said. "The sense of beauty in our race, too, is very poor." Once he suddenly looked up and fixed his eyes on my face. His manner became very earnest. "Now listen to me," he said. "I'm going to read you something. I want you to tell me what you make of it. It's private. That is, I have no right to show it to others, but as no one would understand it, with the exception possibly of yourself, secrecy is not of importance." And his mouth twitched a little. He drew a sheaf of papers from an inner pocket, and I saw they were covered with fine writing. I laughed. This writing always made me laugh. It was so laborious and slow. The writing I knew best, of course, lay all over and inside the earth and skies. The privacy also made me laugh. So strange seemed the idea to me, and so impossible, this idea of secrecy. It was such an admission of ignorance. "I will understand it quickest by reading it," I said. "I take in a page at once, in your block letters." But he preferred to read it out himself, so that he could note the effect upon me, he explained, of definite passages. He saw that I guessed his purpose, and we laughed together a moment. "When you tire of listening," he said, "just tell me, and I'll pause." I gave him my hand to hold. "It helps me to stay here," I explained, and he nodded as he grasped me in his warm, firm clasp. "It's written by one who may have known you and your big rhythms, though I can't be sure," he added. "One of, my patients wrote it, someone who believed she was in communication with a kind of immense nature spirit." Then he began to read in his clear, windy voice. "I sit and weave. I feel strange, as if I had so much consciousness that words cannot explain it. The failure of others makes my work more hard, but my own purposes never fail. I am associated with those who need me. The universal doors are open to me. I compass creation." But already I began to hum my songs, though to please him I kept the music low, and he, dear Filary, did not bid me stop, but only tightened his grasp upon my hand. I listened with pleasure and satisfaction, therefore I hummed. "I am silent, seeking no expression, needing no communication, satisfied with the life that is in me. I do not even wish to be known about." "That's where your race," I put in, "is to me as children. All they do must be shouted about so loud, or they think it has not happened." "I do not wish to be forced to obtrude myself," he went on. "There are hosts like me. We do not want that which does not belong to us. We do not want that hindrance, that opposition which rouses an undesirable consciousness. For without that opposition we could never have known of disobedience. We are formless. The formless is the real. That cannot die. It is eternal." Again he tightened his grasp, and this time also laid his eyes a moment on my own, over the top of his paper, so that I kept my music back with a great effort. For it was hard not to express myself when my own name calling in this fashion. He continued reading aloud. He selected passages now, instead of going straight through the pages. The words helped memory in me. Flashes of what I had forgotten came back in sheets of color and waves of music. The phrases built little spirals, as it were, between two states. Of these two states, I now divined, he understood one perfectly, his own, and the other, mine, partially. Yet he had a little of both, I knew, in himself. With me it was similar, only the understood state was not the same with us. To the race, of course, what he read would have no meaning. "The comely one of the 4 figures," I said. "How they would turn white and run if they could hear you, showing their yellow teeth and dim eyes." His face remained grave and eager, though I could see the laughter running about beneath the tight brown skin as he went on reading his little bits. We heard nothing of man, and were rarely even conscious of him, although he benefited from our work in all that sustained and conditioned him. The wise are silent, the foolish speak, and the children are thus led astray, for wisdom is not knowledge. It is a realization of the scheme and of one's own part in it. He took a firmer, broader grip of my hand as he read the next bit. I felt the tremble of his excitement run into my wrist and arm. His voice deepened and shook. It was like a little storm. Then, suddenly, we heard man's triumphant voice. We became conscious of him as an evolving entity. Our work had told. We had built his form and processes so faithfully. We knew that when he reached his height, we must be submissive to his will. A gust of memory flashed by me as I heard those small but perfect, exquisite, lovely rhythms. Who called me here? Whose voice reached after me, bringing me into this undesirable consciousness? I cried aloud as the memory went tearing by, then vanished before I could recover it. At the same time, Filari let go my hand, and the little bridge was snapped. I felt what he called pain. It passed at once. I found his hand again, but the bridge was not rebuilt. How white his skin had grown, I noticed, as I looked up at his face. But the eyes shone grandly. "I shall find the way," I said. "We shall go back together to our eternal home." He went on reading as though I had not interrupted, but I found it less easy to listen now. I realized then that he was gone. He had left the room, though I had not seen him go. I had been away. It was some days ago that this occurred. It was today, a few hours ago, that I seized the comely one and tried to comfort her, poor hungry member of this little race. But both occurrences help us, help dear Filari and myself, to understand how difficult it is to answer his questions and tell him exactly what he wants to know. "How long, O Lord, how long?" I hear his yearning cry. Yet other beings cannot help us. They can only tell us what their own part is. After the door had clicked, I knew release for a bit. Release from a state I partially understood, and so found irksome, into another where I felt at home, and so found pleasurable. In the big rhythms my nature expressed itself apparently. I rose, seeking my lost companions. They, the Debenham and his busy little figures, called it sleep. It may be sleep, but I find there what I seek yet have forgotten, and that with me were dear Filari and another, a comely one whom he brings, as though we belong together and have a common origin. But this other comely one, who is it? End of Chapter 9.